in the Asteria Kingdom, located east of the continent's center, in a small room on the right side of the second floor of the Count Palatios' residence. In the southern region. Did you successfully carry out the order? Yes, that is correct. The knight, standing, lowered his head in response to the man sitting on the bed. As you commanded, I rescued the orphans in the small village in the eastern part of the kingdom. No, rather, the orphans in the facility for human experimentation. And did you ensure the orphanage was properly managed? Yes, just as you instructed. I left the orphanage in the hands of a girl named Utia. Did you finish the discussion with the Baron's family managing that village? Yes, as soon as I showed them the documents related to the human experimentation, they obediently accepted all our demands, including the entire castle. With that, the knight, Evan, pulled out a leather pouch from his chest and placed it in front of Alan's side table. Good. Elan opened the pouch and smiled with satisfaction as he looked at the gold coins inside. Young master, if I may ask one thing. After a moment of silence, Evan spoke. What is it? You said the reason you attacked the human experimentation facility in Baron Alphon's territory was to save that girl, Udia, right? As Elan nodded, gesturing for him to continue, Evan spoke further. Indeed, she was extraordinary. I've lived a long time as a mercenary myself. Evan paused as if to gather his thoughts, then continued. But it's hard to understand why such a powerful girl was locked up in that facility. And why did you just leave her at the orphanage? Elan remained silent in response to the question, which carried a tone of slight incomprehension. In truth, Evan's question was entirely reasonable. Rescuing a girl like Utia, without making use of her in any way, was an act that brought no benefit. But that was only from Evan's perspective. The situation looked quite different from Alan's viewpoint. I removed one of the world's destruction flags, and that's enough for now. Utia, her real name was Utia Bludia. In 10 years, she would become one of the 5 great sins, the sin of wrath, and wipe out 2 of the 5 allied kingdoms from the continent, causing hundreds of thousands of casualties. If someone were to ask how Elan knew what would happen 10 years later, it was because he was a person who had been reincarnated. Moreover, he was aware that this world would be utterly destroyed in 10 years as a dark fantasy RPG game called Psychedelia. Sigh. Elan clutched his throbbing head as he remembered the moment he first regained consciousness 2 months ago and let out a deep sigh. At first, just realizing that this was a fantasy world made me bedridden for 3 days, and then discovering that it was 10 years before the main plot of Psychedelia started made me sick for 10 more. Initially, when Elan thought he had merely reincarnated into a fantasy world, he despaired for about 3 days. However, as he began to adapt to the world, the situation didn't seem so bad. Surprisingly, being a noble was quite manageable. The life of a noble was incredibly comfortable. He could wake up whenever he wanted, sleep whenever he wanted, do whatever he wanted, and eat whenever he felt like it. Although he was the 3rd son of a count and held no real power, he was in a position where he could fully enjoy the pleasures of life without responsibility. That's why, at first, he was somewhat happy. For someone who had worked 78 hours a week at a low-paying job, the life of a noble was unbelievably luxurious. Of course, not being able to access the internet, the pinnacle of modern civilization, was a severe drawback. Still, the life of a noble was satisfying enough to overlook that. But that only lasted for a while. Alan's mood darkened rapidly once he realized that this continent was named Amplin, and even more so when he recalled that the noble family he had reincarnated into was the Count Palatios family. Amplin was the name of the continent in Psychedelia, the game he had played during his sparse free time while slaving away at work, and the Count Palatios family was briefly mentioned in one of the game's quests. The despair he felt upon realizing that this was 10 years before the main plot of Psychedelia began was as crushing as the time when his paycheck had been delayed for 3 consecutive months. The world of Psychedelia was one where all living creatures, whether nobles or commoners, would be mercilessly ground to dust in 10 years. Among the most doomed was the Asteria Kingdom, to which the Count Palatios family belonged. In any game route, the moment one of the 5 great sins appeared, the kingdom was wiped off the map. In other words, it was destroyed. The kingdom would disappear. The nobility would vanish. Cities would be obliterated. In short, Alan's noble life as the 3rd son of the Count Palatio family would inevitably come to an end in 10 years. Thus, if Alan wished to continue enjoying his peaceful noble life, he would have to eliminate all 5 great sins, who were destined to become human-killing machines in the future. and what he was doing now was part of that plan. Well, that's it. However, there was no way he could explain all this to Evan. It's just that the time hasn't come yet. The time hasn't come. Yes, anyway, make sure this matter doesn't leak to the outside, and continue supporting the orphanage as requested. Oh, and one more thing. Ilan pulled out a letter from his chest and handed it over. Deliver this letter to her. This letter? Evan asked curiously, and Ilan replied, yes. Strictly speaking, it was something important. The letter contained a phrase that always appeared in a mandatory event. When encountering the sin of wrath in the game Psychedelia, the suffering of the dark, the enlightenment of the light, a single despair and belonging. This phrase was uttered by a slightly suspicious archbishop NPC from a certain holy country, who would accompany the protagonist and attempt to calm the sin of wrath. However, the moment he spoke, the archbishop would turn into a pile of blood, and the sin of wrath would, with an irritated expression, say, "It's too late," before the battle began. The reason Ilan now chose to use this phrase was because the current time was what the sin of wrath referred to as the past during the game. He had seen the phrase repeatedly while playing the game over and over, labeled as a spell that could befriend the bloodline, as stated by the Archbishop NPC. Of course, it's ridiculous to think that reciting one spell would turn you into a friend of those insane creatures who make pacts with Cthulhu and wield power. But considering these are people who worship such beings, it oddly makes sense. It was impossible to predict the thoughts of those whose minds bordered on fanaticism. As Ilan watched the mercenary knight bow respectfully and leave the room, he shrugged and thought to himself, now that I've removed the first landmine, it's time for the second. A few days later, here's the letter. Evan, having received Alan's orders, arrived at the orphanage once again and handed the letter to her, unable to hide his unease. It was understandable, given that the girl, Yudia, standing before him, was strange. Her red eyes, in stark contrast to her white hair, held no emotion whatsoever. No, not even a trace of emotion could be detected. Complete apathy. The girl, who looked as if she regarded every being in the world as mere objects, extended her hand and accepted the letter with the same expression she had when Evan first rescued her from the orphanage. Russell, Yudia silently began to open the letter. Evan's expression remained puzzled, unable to comprehend why she had been confined in such a facility. Although he hadn't reached mastery, Evan could manipulate mana, and with that came the ability to sense the energy of others. Moreover, Evan's talent for sensing mana was significantly superior to that of other knights, allowing him to perceive it with far greater accuracy. That's why he could tell. No matter how you look at it, this doesn't make sense. The girl standing before him was far too formidable to have been locked up in such a place. And as Evan pondered this, another question arose in his mind. It was about the third son of the Count Palacio family who had hired him a few months ago at a tavern. During his time as a mercenary, Evan had heard that the third son of the Count Palacio family was treated as a virtual outcast, the typical untalented bastard child of a noble house. Additionally, there were rumors that, due to his timid nature, he was often bullied by his notorious elder brothers, who were known as scoundrels. So how did such a third son of the Count know about the secret human experimentation that the Baron's family was conducting in that hidden facility? I don't understand at all. As Evan was lost in thought, his eyes suddenly widened. The reason was, the expressionless Yutia, who had been standing there until a moment ago, now had a broad smile on her lips. No, it was more than just a smile. Her mana is becoming visible to the naked eye, displaying a skill that could only be shown by those who had reached a certain level of mastery. She was doing so effortlessly. And then, the person who sent this letter, was it Sir Ilan? As Yutia spoke, her vertical pupils, characteristic of the bloodline, similar to a reptile's, gazed directly at Evan. Even with that mere glance, Evan, who had reached the rank of an expert, felt an instinctive warning from his senses, and though he silently gasped in shock, he quickly composed himself and replied, "Yes, why didn't he call me?" Yuchia's question. Although the thought crossed his mind that he didn't know, Evan refrained from saying it carelessly. His instincts told him it would be a bad idea. Instead, Evan recalled a casual remark Ilan had made and responded. He said the time wasn't right. "I see." A short reply, but it was the correct answer, as evidenced by the long, curved smile on her lips. Yutia Bludia, no. I understand. The first daughter of the bloodline, Yutia Bloody Queen, moved her enchanting red lips and said, "I understand his will." with the letter containing a secret phrase known only to her master held close. She twisted her lips into a bizarre smile. 3 months had passed since Alan rescued Utia Bludia, who would become a human extermination machine in 10 years. During those 3 months, Alan faithfully lived each day and managed to locate the second sin that needed saving. About a month later, as you instructed, I rescued the child from the illegal slave market and sent them to the orphanage managed by Udia. Alan, who was in the study on some business, heard the report from Evan. You treated them well, as I said. Yes, there were no fights. Of course. Alan, accustomed to Evan's reports after nearly half a year, nodded as if satisfied. But once again, Evan hesitantly asked a question. But may I ask you something? What is it? Why did you send the child you went to such lengths to find to the orphanage? I hesitate to say this, but the child you rescued this time also has an extraordinary talent. Understanding Evan's meaning immediately, Alan nodded thoughtfully. Not just extraordinary, it's world-ending level talent. The man Alan had rescued this time from the illegal slave market in the kingdom of Kalian, the central nation of the Allied Kingdoms, was none other than Deus McCallion, one of the bosses in psychedelia, who would become the sin of sloth, one of the 5 great sins in 10 years, and, like the sin of wrath, he would erase several allied kingdoms, including the kingdom of Asteria, from the continent as soon as he appeared, and he did so in the worst possible way. Even as a player, Alan had frowned at the gory depiction, and there were instances in psychedelia-related communities where players would have visceral reactions just from reading about Sloth's portrayal, and for a sloth, he sure holds a grudge. The reason Alan had told Evan to treat Deus well after rescuing him came to mind. Realizing that Evan was still waiting for an answer, Alan casually offered an excuse. It's the same as before. The time hasn't come yet. The time, you say? Watching Evan mull over his excuse, Alan thought to himself, he's curious about a lot. In truth, Alan would have preferred a knight who silently followed orders without asking questions over Evan, who inquired about everything each time he received an order. Unfortunately, he had no choice in the matter, or rather, he had already used that choice on Evan half a year ago. Evan was a character in psychedelia who, while not a main protagonist, would appear several times depending on certain routes as a supporting character. Moreover, he was a top-tier supporting character who, once a certain level of trust was established, would never betray you and would uphold his loyalty until the end. In a fantasy world where betrayal and backstabbing were as common as daily meals, Alan knew how valuable it was to have someone who wouldn't stab him in the back. Fortunately, he had encountered Evan while he was passing through the territory, and had hired him as a knight without hesitation. I understand. While Alan was lost in thought, Evan nodded firmly, as if he understood everything, and asked another question. So, when do you plan to meet the ones you've rescued? I don't particularly plan to, but wouldn't it be better to meet them at least once? Alan was aware. Ideally, it would be beneficial to maintain a close relationship with the 5 great sins, and the best way to build rapport would be through direct interaction. However, despite this awareness, the reason Alan chose not to meet them directly and instead maintained a relationship through sponsorship was due to their personalities, specifically their character flaws. According to what he knew, the personalities of the 5 great sins were dreadful even before they became the 5 great sins. One only needed to watch the flashback scenes that played after defeating the bosses of the 5 great sins in psychedelia to understand. Their personalities were so vile that Satan and Lucifer would clap their hands in approval. From the depths of hell, of course, the process that leads them to become the 5 great sins is even more horrific. Alan thought briefly before continuing. Well, I did save them before their personalities could fully deteriorate, so it shouldn't get that bad. But then again, I did only save them halfway through. In conclusion, the personalities of the 5 great sins were bound to be twisted in some way, which gave him reason to hesitate. Maybe in about 5 years. By then, Evan would have gathered enough data to accurately assess the average personalities of the sins. When Alan gave this somewhat optimistic answer, Evan nodded, just as the door to the study suddenly burst open. Well, if it isn't Alan. At the sound of the familiar voice calling his name, Alan frowned slightly and let out a sigh. He knew the owner of that voice all too well. Why is my illiterate brother in here? Turning to the source of the voice, he saw a man approaching with a sly expression. Or rather, when your elder brother speaks, shouldn't you respond? It was Tonio, the second son of the Palacio Count's family, known as one of the scoundrel brothers of the Count's family. He wore a grin that was unpleasant at first glance and casually placed his arm on Alan's head as he sat, a blatantly disrespectful act. I just stopped by to look for something, even as Tonio deliberately pressed down on his head, causing a slight pain. Alan calmly answered as if nothing was wrong, thinking to himself, here we go again. This wasn't the first time either the eldest or the second son had treated Alan like this. In fact, they had openly bullied him since the moment he had reincarnated, even before he took over Alan's body. The original Alan must have been subjected to such harassment continuously. However, the reason Alan chose not to react and let it pass, despite the annoyance, was because his desire to maintain a peaceful, noble life was stronger. If I mess with these bastards, my plan will be ruined from the start. If his opponents were truly on the level of the Count's scoundrel duo, Alan would have loved to crush them thoroughly. But the problem was that their level was not that simple. Dealing with a drug lord and a pimp king is tricky. Alan glanced upward. There, the second son of the Count's family, who ran a drug cartel with the grand name of Avalon in the underworld, gazed down at him with a blatant sneer. Of course, the cartel wasn't a large organization by any means, only known to some extent within the kingdom. But unfortunately, the current Alan was incapable of dealing with a piece of trash who could, with a snap of his fingers, order dozens of assassins from the underworld to eliminate him without leaving a trace. Even if he managed to get rid of him, he would then have to face the eldest son, who was in a power struggle with the second son and ran the prostitution rings instead. Given that the eldest was highly sensitive about the succession issue, he would never let Alan, who had defeated the second son, go unpunished. In other words, Alan knew that once he reacted, there would be no turning back. It seems my elder brother wishes to use the study, so I'll be leaving now. At least you know your place. Alan respectfully bowed to Tonio, whose face was full of scorn, and left the study with Evan to return to his room. Soon, Evan handed him Yutya's letter. This time, I brought it personally. Did you? Since rescuing Yutya, Alan had been exchanging letters with her on a monthly basis. The content of the letters usually consisted of simple greetings and updates about each other's daily lives. It had been Alan who suggested they exchange letters in the first place. She might feel closer to a pen pal than if we met in person. Recalling the friends he once felt closer to in online chat rooms than in real life, Alan opened the letter and began to read. HMM. The letter contained nothing special, as usual. Yutya wrote a brief greeting and shared some stories about a few of the orphans. To summarize a bit, it mentioned that a boy named Haydn was very good at playing war games and that a girl named Yuna was excellent at hide and seek. Reading through the ordinary stories, Alan pondered what he should write in his reply and decided to faithfully recount what had happened that day. He figured that instead of only writing pleasant things, sharing some of his worries might help them grow closer psychologically. With that in mind, Alan wrote about the events of the day and sent the letter to Yutya at the orphanage. It was just an ordinary day. At that time, HMM, Yutya was observing Deus Mikayan, a man with ominous, eerie, violet eyes that seemed void. On the surface, he appeared fine. His limbs were intact, though his body bore numerous signs of abuse. He didn't seem physically hindered, but that was only on the surface. If anyone else saw Deus Mikayan, they would be convinced that he was broken. His body might have been intact, but his eyes, which should have shown some emotion, were empty, staring blankly into space. He was like a man whose mind had been shattered by mental magic, expressionless and motionless, staring vacantly at a single spot. He was the very image of a broken man. However, Yutya smiled deeply as she looked at him. The traces left by that thing, allowing to take direct revenge. You're truly considerate. More than just smiling. Yutya clearly understood the intent behind why he had sent Deus here and spoke. Black goat. Just a single word. But that single word was enough to elicit a response from Deus, who had been no different from a broken man until just moments ago. What filled his once empty eyes was neither intelligence nor awareness, but pure hatred, anger, and fear. Confirming this, Yutya smiled and spoke. Don't you want revenge? At Yutya's words, Deus's vacant gaze shifted to her. His eyes were filled with hatred, murderous intent, and curiosity. Noticing this easily, Yutya didn't say anything more. She simply scattered a light amount of mana, a mana that he had granted, meant solely to confront the Black Ones. Congratulations, he has chosen you, so you will gain power. She didn't elaborate further on the mana she had released. No, there was no need to. The second one he had chosen possessed a talent so exceptional that it could be explained with a single action. Thus, so all you need to do is remain loyal to him. Then you'll get your revenge. Yuja smiled as she looked at Deus. And so, as a week passed since Deus arrived at the orphanage, Yuja received another letter from Alan, as usual. I see. After reading the letter, she smiled. As a year passed since Deus had been placed in the orphanage, and Yutia and Alan continued to exchange ordinary letters, Alan was starting to feel a headache over not being able to find the third boss to save. That was when a piece of news reached his ears. The scoundrel is dead. The second son of the Palacio Count's family was dead. In Psychedelia, the Count Palacio's family is portrayed as a textbook example of an evil character in a subquest, serving as nothing more than fodder for the protagonist's experience points before disappearing. In game terms, they're essentially extras, however. The reason Alan had quite a bit of information about the Count Palacio's family was that he had repeatedly dealt with subquests related to them while playing the game. The experience points from the subquests involving the Count's family were quite generous. In short, in the game, these characters were nothing more than extras meant to provide experience points to the protagonist. But that was only true when seeing them through the lens of a game. For Alan, who now found himself in a reality where the game world had become his reality, his feelings about the Count's family were quite different. The game merely described the family as selling drugs and running a prostitution ring under the organization called Avalon. But now, Alan had seen the actual, albeit fragmented, reality with his own eyes. Even now, he was witnessing it firsthand. Alan subtly shifted his gaze forward. In front of him was the corpse of Tonio, the recently deceased, lying inside a coffin. Cause of death, accidental fall, right? For a man who was a major player in the kingdom's drug trade, it was an absurdly anticlimactic and empty death, but naturally, Alan knew that Tonio's cause of death was not an accidental fall. In fact, it would be strange if anyone present here didn't know the truth. Privacy settings. Alan turned his gaze to the side. Next to him, bowing his head with a deep smile, was Leo, the eldest son of the Count Palacio's family, who had been locked in a power struggle with Tonio for the position of family head. His smile might split his face. Leo wasn't even trying to hide his grin anymore. His expression was practically unmanaged. Anyone could predict that Tonio's death wasn't due to an accidental fall. Yet, despite everyone knowing this, no one voiced any objections to Leo, not the knights, not the retainers, not even Aldemar, the current head of the Count Palacio's family, said a word to his eldest son. Well, Aldemar's too far gone from indulging in drugs and women to care whether his sons are tearing each other apart, not like he's capable of saying anything anymore. Alan let out a small, sarcastic laugh as he watched the Count, who was so devoid of dignity that even during Tonio's funeral, he was surrounded by drugs and women. As expected of a dark fantasy, the state of this family is a complete mess. Of course, Alan had no special intention of doing anything about it. From the beginning, Alan's plan was proceeding smoothly without him having to do much. And the only real problem he faced was the 5 great sins. I need to find the rest quickly. As Alan thought about this, he watched the final stages of the funeral unfold. As the coffin containing Tonio was about to be sealed, a question suddenly crossed Alan's mind. Was Tonio's death supposed to happen like this? When he played the episode involving the Count Palacio's family in the game, only Leo appeared, so it wasn't difficult for Alan to predict Tonio's death. However, what made him question Tonio's death now was something Leo had said while being disciplined by the protagonist. Didn't he mention, after suffering for years, that he finally killed Tonio and became the undisputed heir? Having played the game multiple times, and recalling how ridiculous Leo looked in his final moments, Alan couldn't help but tilt his head in confusion. Still, he quickly shrugged it off. After all, it wasn't something he was deeply concerned about. A few days after Tonio's funeral, the Count Palacio's family, which had been in turmoil due to the second son's death, suddenly became remarkably peaceful. The succession battle had ended, although the Count had a third son, Alan, in addition to Tonio. No one expected the family to descend into chaos again. Everyone knew that unlike Tonio, who had aligned with the underworld and sold drugs to gain power to oppose the eldest son, Alan had no power whatsoever. Privacy settings. Even Leo, who was highly sensitive to the succession issue, showed no concern about Alan and didn't pay him any attention. Instead, Leo seemed more preoccupied with swallowing up the drug trade that Tonio had left behind. Anyway, with peace returning to the Count's family, Alan was reading a letter from Yudia. The letters they had exchanged for almost a year now were always the same. Nothing special. The content of the letter mostly revolved around the orphanage. She wrote about how some of the children were growing well, and there were also a few brief mentions of Deus, whom Alan had sent there. They're growing well without any issues. Alan smiled with satisfaction as he read the short line in Yudia's letter. When he had sent Deus to the orphanage, he had asked Yudia to take special care of him since he was a bit of a difficult child, and she always included a short update on Deus in her letters. Talking to her through letters like this, she really comes off as a kind, innocent girl from the countryside. He briefly considered visiting her, but quickly shook his head and continued reading the letter. As he neared the end of the letter, Alan suddenly spoke. Evan. Yes, what is it? Do orphanages usually receive a lot of donations? Usually. Well, they probably receive some, but not too many, I'd think. That's what I thought. The reason Alan had asked about donations was because of a donation list written at the end of Yudia's letter. Was it 3 months ago, or for months? Curiously, starting a few months ago, someone else had begun donating to the orphanage that Alan had been supporting. Of course, the letter only mentioned that a merchant named Milano had made a donation, so he didn't know the exact amount. But this month, 5 people, including me, donated to the orphanage. Though his expression grew puzzled while reading the letter, Alan quickly dismissed it. Well, the more donations, the better. With that, Alan wrote a reply to Yudia, half-heartedly agreeing with her stories, and handed it to Evan. Are you going to deliver it personally again? No. Didn't I go there just a few months ago? Privacy settings. 3 months ago, I believe. And what did you say back then? If you're asking about the orphanage, I reported that it was running well. Deus, who I delivered there, also seemed to be much better. Really? Alan nodded with satisfaction at Evan's report. As I thought, even though they're destined to become the 5 great sins, they couldn't have been evil from the beginning. It feels good to see that the kids are growing up well. It must have been their environment that turned them into killers in the first place. Alan was once again struck by how crucial a person's environment is for their growth, and he added, this time, there's no need to go in person. Just ask someone from the mercenary guild to deliver it. Understood. Evan nodded and was about to leave when something seemed to dawn on him. And, do you remember that thing you mentioned last time? Thing I mentioned. The ancient book. Did you find it? I'm not entirely sure, but I found a lead. Tell me about it. At Alan's command, Evan began to relay the information he had gathered from the intelligence guild, piece by piece, and eventually, I've found it. He discovered the location of the third sin. Margot, the estate of a viscount located beside a small village in the eastern part of the Asteria kingdom, was known for its beautiful glass crafts as its specialty. However, that was only the surface of Margot's reputation. In reality, the true source of wealth for the Margot Viscount's family was drugs. More specifically, a group called Phelan used Margot as a distribution hub, providing the Viscount's family with a hefty income. Phelan, which had been steadily growing its power by using Margot as a distribution point, had now become a massive organization with hundreds of members, each led by over 10 expert-level fighters. Because of this, Rotten, the leader of Phelan and an expert mercenary like the other executives, believed that Phelan would continue to grow even more. At least, that's what he thought until yesterday. Privacy settings. Rotten looked around with fearful eyes. In front of him were dozens of corpses drenched in blood, lying on the ground. Please, spare me, please, I beg you. There were only a few remaining members of the organization left, screaming desperately. Rotten looked at them with trembling eyes. Normally, he would have felt reassured by the sight of his remaining men, who should have been like a sturdy shield. Even if they were weaker than him, their sheer number should have been enough to provide some sense of security. Yet despite this, Rotten felt nothing but fear as he looked at them. Ugh, please. The surviving members of the organization were all holding their swords in reverse grips, pressing the blades against their own necks. No, don't, no. Stop, please stop, I beg you, please. Each of their faces was filled with desperation and pleading, but despite this, their bodies, as if moving naturally, pressed the reversed blades into their own throats. Schlack. The last remaining dozen or so members took their own lives. And then, Rotten's body began to move on its own. And no, he gripped his sword in a reverse grip. Please. No matter how hard he tried to resist, his body, once taken over, no longer listened to him and only trembled. In his final moments, Rotten saw it. In the darkness of the hideout, violet eyes staring directly at him. Privacy settings. But the moment he saw them, Schlunk, Rotten plunged his sword into his own throat. Blood. With that, Deus, who had been shrouded in darkness, silently stepped forward and walked out. Well done. Likewise, Utya, who had been with Deus, naturally followed him outside. Is there any point in killing these people? As if he had been waiting, Deus asked the question as Utya walked out. Unlike a year ago, there was a clear light of reason in his eyes. Are you feeling sympathetic? No. I know these people were grinding up humans to make drugs. Then, I'm just wondering if killing them will help us kill those bastards. In response to Deus's question, Utya smiled and said, Of course. Her answer was clear. This is just laying the groundwork for his return. Blood. With her words, a pattern began to form beneath her feet. Engraved in the magic circle was a giant eye with a crescent moon inside. When he arrives, we wouldn't want his place to be in squalor, would we? I understand. Deus, who had been staring at the pattern beneath her feet, nodded as if he had grasped her intent. He said nothing more. All is as he wills. Muttering those words, which he had repeated countless times, the two finished drawing the magic circle beneath them and disappeared into the darkness, leaving no one behind in Phelan's hideout. Time passed, and it was now the second year since Alan had rescued Utya and begun exchanging letters with her. Regularly. I've successfully rescued them again this time. Is that so? Alan received the good news from Evan. Did you send them to the orphanage? Yes, this makes it the fifth one. At Evan's words, Alan nodded. Over the past year, Alan had successfully rescued the 3 sins he originally planned to save. Saving the sin of greed was a bit tricky. The third sin he rescued, who is currently known by the name Rhine Groff, was difficult to find. But rescuing her itself wasn't that challenging. The same went for the other sins. It took a few months to locate each one, but with Alan diligently using his game knowledge to direct Evan, they were all found. As he looked at Evan, who had been running around to rescue the 5 great sins over the past year, Alan spoke. You can take a break now. Is it over? It's over. Privacy settings. That's a relief. Evan let out a sigh of relief and looked at Alan. But, young master, aren't you happy? Of course, I'm happy. You don't look like it though. Really? At Evan's remark, Alan turned to look at the mirror. In it was the face of Alan, a face he had grown accustomed to. Indeed, the man reflected in the mirror had a blank expression. No, on closer inspection, the corners of his mouth were slightly raised, but the change in his expression was so subtle that it would be hard to notice, unless one looked closely. Alan tried to force his face into a smile, but stopped when he saw that his face, which was normally quite decent looking, now looked like that of a strange man. It feels like only my facial muscles didn't fully adapt to this body. Unlike before, when his emotions were clearly displayed, Alan's face now rarely showed any expression. Even if it did, the change was exceedingly subtle. Not that it's a bad thing. Of course, Alan didn't think much of it. The fact that his emotions didn't show wasn't a problem for him, but rather for others who interacted with him. He wasn't particularly bothered by it. Anyway, this concludes everything I needed to do for now. Alan smiled as he thought of the 5 potential sins he had gathered at the orphanage. I didn't expect things to go this well. In truth, Alan hadn't expected things to go so smoothly from the start. The 5 great sins had every reason to become the monsters they were destined to be. No matter how hard Alan tried, it wasn't like he could save them before they encountered any misfortune at all. In other words, Alan's only concern had been that he wouldn't be able to save the 5 great sins until they were already too far gone. But contrary to his worries, all 5 of the sins were growing up normally. Evan, yes, when you visited the orphanage last time, you said there didn't seem to be any problems, right? When I checked, even Ryan and Seolrang, who were in bad shape before arriving at the orphanage, had returned to a relatively normal state. Really? Privacy settings. Yes, when I first rescued Seolrang, she was like a broken doll, doing nothing and just staying still. But at the orphanage, she was getting along well. Similarly, when I first rescued Ryan, she kept her eyes closed as if she didn't want to see anything. But when I saw her last, she was reading a book with interest. At Evan's report, Alan nodded. The content matched what Yutia had written in her letters. I didn't expect Yutia to do such a good job. Initially, Elan had left Yutia at the orphanage not only to keep her at a distance, but also because there was a setting in which she was somewhat attached to the orphanage. However, he hadn't been entirely sure that she would take care of the other children as well, and he had originally planned to send Evan to check on the situation and, if necessary, bring in professional help. But that's not necessary anymore. Elan smiled. Everything had gone even better than he expected, and thanks to Yuji's efforts, there was now only one thing left for Elan to do: develop some level of self-defense skills. Of course, as the third son of the Palacio Count's family, if he didn't take any particular action, his life wouldn't be in danger, especially since Evan was by his side. But given that this world was based on a dark fantasy, it was essential to have at least some ability to protect himself. He was considering learning magic. Oh, by the way, have you heard about the Blue Moon, young master? While he was pondering this, Evan's question brought Elan back to the present. The Blue Moon. Yes, it's a recently famous organization in the eastern regions. From what I've heard, they've been hunting down other organizations. An organization hunting other organizations. Yes, then they're doing a good thing. Elan responded dully, having fully adapted to the dark fantasy world. If the Blue Moon were massacring civilians, it would be a cause for concern. But if they were hunting other organizations, that was a different story. After all, in this continent, Elan had never seen or heard of any organization that didn't involve death in some way. If they were hunting those who played with human lives, there wasn't much reason to view them negatively, so Elan simply responded as such. The problem is that they're also killing nobles. Evan. Yes, young master. Privacy settings. Starting today, you'll sleep in the room next to mine, Elan said decisively after hearing Evan's follow-up. Considering that this Blue Moon organization wasn't mentioned in the original story, it's likely that they disappear before the main events start. But come to think of it, Leo's been in a bad mood lately. Could it be because of them? As Elan pondered this, he shrugged and began writing a letter in response to the one he received from Yuja yesterday. As usual, Yuja's letter contained the same kind of content: some greetings, a brief update on the current state of those Elan had asked her to take care of, and a list of sponsors. After confirming this, Elan considered mentioning the Blue Moon organization that Evan had just told him about, but decided against it. The Blue Moon might be hunting organizations and nobles, but they weren't targeting orphanages filled with children. As always, Elan finished writing the letter and sent it through the Mercenary Guild. It was a relaxed day. A few weeks later, at the orphanage in the eastern region, during a regular meeting that had begun on a weekly basis after activities had officially started, Yuja was reading the letter Elan had sent. Is that a letter from him? Let me read it. Me too. Me too. I want to read it. A girl enthusiastically waved her hand, while another girl opposite her quietly raised her own hand as Yuja read the letter. Even in the dimly lit hideout, their golden and green eyes sparkled. These were Seolring and Rhine, the future sins of pride and greed, respectively. Here, really, can I really see it? You didn't let me see it last time. It's about time I did. Yuja smiled as she handed the letter over. Seolring and Rhine, along with Deus, who had been silently watching, all looked at the letter with curiosity. A little while later, is this an instruction sheet? It just looks like an ordinary conversation. They all expressed their confusion as they reread the letter before them. The letter contained nothing but mundane daily conversation. Deus, seeking an explanation, looked at Yutia with a questioning expression, and she smiled as she explained. That's how it's supposed to look. He ordered me from the beginning to write it as if it were just a normal conversation. Privacy settings. Then, Yuja pulled out a slightly worn letter from her chest and showed it to them. The content of the letter was simple. It started with casual greetings and naturally moved on to suggest that they regularly exchange letters about the orphanage. Seolring and Rhine frowned, puzzled, but Deus, seemingly understanding the true intent behind the letter, spoke. Is it because he doesn't want any secrets to be leaked, so he exchanges letters in this way? Correct. I see. Deus nodded in agreement, then glanced at Seolring and Rhine, who were still focused on the letter. If he's worried about leaks, wouldn't it be better to use magic communication or have us go and report in person regularly? Right. Then why insist on using letters? Because that's his will. Yuja smiled as she added, if he's decided to do it this way, we follow. There's no need to question or think about it. At her words, Deus felt a dryness in his mouth. While Yuji's emotions were generally calm, whenever she spoke about him, there was a deep, unsettling conviction that even made his skin crawl. Understood. Thus, Deus nodded quietly, looking into her red eyes, which now gleamed with the light of a fanatic. With that, Yuji collected the letter she had distributed to the members and carefully stored it in her chest, marking the end of the meeting. Seolring, what about the North? You mean the slavers? Yes. At Yuji's question, Seolring flashed a bright smile. I took care of them all. And your identity? I wasn't exposed. The clothes Ryan made seemed to be working well. I gave them a quiz, saying I'd let them live if they could correctly describe my face, but no one could answer. And then, privacy settings. I plucked them all, their heads. Her words were excessively brutal for such a cheerful laugh, but Yutia calmly turned her gaze to Deus. And the South. Avalon was running rampant, so I cleaned them up. And I found something else to discuss while I was there. What is it? The head of Avalon is the eldest son of the Count's family where he resides, correct? Yutia nodded silently at Deus's question. However, it seems the eldest son is trying to poison him. As soon as he said that, what? The atmosphere froze. Just moments ago, Seolring, who had been smiling brightly, folded her ears back and looked around nervously, while Ryan, who had been quietly observing, fixed her gaze forward. The only one who could look Yutia in the eyes was Deus, who had anticipated this reaction, but even he felt a cold sweat running down his back as he sensed the overwhelming killing intent. That was far stronger than expected. After a short while, are you certain? There was an instruction sheet. Did you bring it? Yes. Deus pulled out the letter from his chest as if he had been waiting for this moment. Without blinking, Yutia read the letter. Once the Count, whose lifespan is nearly over, dies, quietly poison him and dispose of him. After reading that final line, I see. She gripped the instruction sheet tightly. So, it's true. With a chilling look in her eyes, she muttered softly. 2 years had passed since Alan rescued all the 5 great sins, marking the 4th year since he began exchanging letters with Yudia. There were now 6 years left until the start of the original story. The Count Palacio was dead. The official cause of death was heart failure. However, anyone within the Count's household or those well-informed would have easily known the real cause of death. It was an overdose of drugs. In a death fitting of a dark fantasy world, the Count Palacio had passed away. However, no one mourned his death. The servants and retainers accepted the news of his death with a sense of calm. This was no surprise, given that the Count Palacio had been completely broken, running his last stretch toward death with rampant drug abuse. It would have been strange not to expect such an outcome. Moreover, his life had been wasted in indulgence, consumed by women and drugs, even after his death. Not a single noble expressed condolences. This also applied to his 2 remaining sons. The eldest son, Leo, had anticipated this outcome long ago and remained indifferent. Rather than mourning his father's death, Leo seemed more preoccupied with the ongoing conflict with the Blue Moon organization, constantly discussing it with the retainers loyal to him. Elan felt the same. From the beginning, his father had turned a blind eye as the eldest and second sons openly tormented him. Surprisingly, Elan had never spoken to the Count even once since he had taken over this body. Their relationship was one of mutual indifference. Thus, the Count's death passed in silence, without a single tear shed, and quietly came to an end. A week after the Count's death, the Palacio family did not appoint a new head, following their long-standing tradition that no new head would be selected in the same year. The previous one died. Yet, nothing really changed. Since the time Alan had taken over this body, the Count Palacio had done nothing, leaving the retainers to manage the family while they lined their pockets. And at this point, Alan, young master, I must say, it's truly astonishing. Why, reaching the 2nd tier in just 2 years without entering the magic tower or having a master? Do you think that's a talent that makes sense? Alan had been learning magic for self-defense, though it's only half-baked. Alan gazed at the 3 small spheres spinning in his palm, before letting them dissipate with a light sigh. It's good that I have talent, but still. 2 years ago, Alan had discovered his talent for magic and had been overjoyed. In the world of psychedelia, magic was something that could only be used if one had the necessary talent. Moreover, Alan's talent for magic was quite exceptional, considering that it typically took about 4 years for a mage to reach the 2nd tier. The fact that he had achieved it in just 2 years without a master was remarkable. While not exactly a heaven-sent prodigy, He was still a rare case of someone who had managed to become powerful through sheer natural talent. Even Alan himself felt that his ability to control mana with precision was far superior to that of others. What he had just done, levitating 3 electric spheres and making them orbit in his palm, was a useless trick, but it was a skill that could only be performed by those who could control their mana with extreme precision. If only my mana core was bigger. However, the reason Alan referred to his talent as half-baked lay here. His natural mana core was much smaller than average. Not just small, a lot smaller. Although it was possible to expand one's mana core through continuous training, in Alan's case, it was so unnaturally small that he had little hope of significant improvement. Privacy settings. A mana core is akin to one's physical stature, something one is born with. If it comes down to it, I do have a method, but, as Alan licked his lips and continued thinking, Evan asked, "Young master, what do you plan to do now?" "What do you mean?" "Well, next year, the first son the eldest young master will become the head of the family, won't he?" Evan, having almost called him a commoner out of habit, quickly corrected himself. Alan understood what he was asking and replied, "I'll leave." "You're planning to leave the estate?" "Not completely, just to a lower position." "Lower? Do you mean to Rodmill?" At Evan's question, Alan nodded. "That's right. Rodmill. Geographically, it was a village about 4 days' travel south of Palion, the Count Palatios territory. It was under the Count's control, but was flourishing moderately. I plan to move there." "Why?" Evan asked, unable to understand. Though Evan might not grasp the reasoning, this was the final step in Alan's plan. From the start, his goal had been to rescue the 5 great sins from their misery, change the future, and live out his life comfortably as a noble in a world where the United Kingdoms weren't destroyed. In that regard, Rodmill is an excellent choice. First, there was a mansion there that belonged to the 3rd Count Palatio. Second, the village was in a state of moderate growth, making it unlikely that Leo, who would soon become the Count, would pay much attention to it before his death. Third, it was far enough from the Count's estate, about 4 days' travel, that Alan could remain uninvolved in the hero's story of justice and retribution when the original plot began. In short, as long as Alan moved to Rodmill, his plan would be successfully completed. However, finding it bothersome to explain all this to Evan, he simply gave a brief response. "Everything has its time. Young master, you always say that when you don't want to explain." Privacy settings. Alan didn't bother replying to Evan's remark. Instead, "Since we're on the topic, let's start packing." He began preparing to head to Rodmill. Exactly 1 month later, Leo, the eldest son of the Count Palatio's family and a major figure in the underworld as the leader of Avalon, was contemplating something as he watched his younger brother board a carriage with a knight in tow. Leaving this date, what should I do? Whether to kill Alan or not? To be honest, Leo didn't find Alan to be much of a threat. It had been that way since they were children. If the late Tonio had always been a threat, baring his fangs in his bid for succession, Alan, on the other hand, had always been busy bowing his head, constantly watching others and staying out of trouble. Sure, something had changed a bit in him over the past few years, but his attitude hadn't shifted. Even now, Alan had voluntarily chosen to move to the outskirts to avoid getting on Leo's bad side. In truth, Leo had originally planned to quietly dispose of Alan, having him overdosed on drugs at the same time as their father's death. But since Alan had chosen to leave for Rodmill on his own, there was no reason to go through with it. Alan had willingly stepped aside for Leo and seemed to have no intention of becoming his enemy. There was no longer any reason to kill Alan. Yet, the eldest son was still contemplating. Ironically, there was no particular reason for his hesitation. It wasn't that he feared Alan would move to the outskirts and seize the position of heir, nor was it that he found Alan's subservience as a family member disgusting. In fact, Leo had never felt any familial affection for Alan, or for the entire Count's family, for that matter. In the end, the reason Leo was debating whether to kill him was simply that Alan annoyed him. A month ago, when Alan had come to him, bowing his head and saying he would go to Rodmill, it had somehow rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was because he had just heard that one of Avalon's branches had failed to meet its targets, leaving him in a foul mood. Whatever the reason, Alan's life now hung in the balance. Almin, privacy settings. Yes, quietly followed the carriage. In less than a minute, Alan's fate was decided. From Leo's perspective, Alan was someone he could kill on a whim. So, with that in mind, He gave the order, but the person who appeared behind him suddenly asked, "Do you mean to kill him?" Leo felt a pang of confusion. 2 years ago, this young man had proven himself useful and had become one of Leo's trusted subordinates. After numerous trials, he was not someone who would question an order. When Leo gave a command, he followed it without question, without hesitation. "Do you think family means anything too?" So, despite frowning slightly, Leo opened his mouth to correct what he assumed was a misunderstanding. Stab. But instead of words, what came out of Leo's mouth was blood. He spat up crimson blood, his face contorting in shock as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. Still unable to grasp the situation, Leo looked down. A sword had been thrust into his heart. Betrayal. His eyes began to fill with a burning rage, but the man who had stabbed him replied indifferently, "This isn't betrayal. I was never your loyal subordinate to begin with. What are you saying? I was merely waiting for you to give the order." With that single sentence, Leo's expression, twisted with anger and confusion, began to turn to one of horror as a single face popped into his mind. The face of Alan, the third son of the Count's family. But even then, Leo couldn't understand. After all, Haydn had been by his side for over 2 years. He had allowed Haydn to stay by his side without suspicion, even allowing him to guard his back for over a year. In other words, Haydn could have killed him at any time if he wished. Privacy settings. So, with his eyes filled with disbelief and confusion, Leo looked at Haydn, who finally offered an explanation. "We don't act without orders. We're merely the sword of that person, moving only as that person wields us. This is our creed, the unbreakable rule taught to us by the red moon. But, crack, when someone tries to harm the great moon, our swords will move on their own. Schlick. And that is why you've been allowed to live until now." With that, Leo collapsed to the ground, his face hitting the dirt, but his eyes still burned with rage as he struggled to speak. "My men, they won't. Don't worry. The moment you gave that order, Avalon was destined to be wiped off the continent." Haydn, a member of the Blue Moon organization and one of Yudia's direct subordinates, continued, "It's a pity. The Great Moon gave you a chance." With those final words, Haydn turned and walked away. Leo never understood their meaning and died shortly after, a cold, emotionless death. 3 days after arriving in Rodmil, Alan was called back to the Count Palacio's estate. The reason was that Leo, the eldest son of the Count Palacio's family, had died, and with his inexplicable death, Alan, who had been leisurely toasting bread in a remote corner of the mansion because there were no serva and teas available, was hurriedly called back to the estate. By then, he had already gained a new nickname that people whispered in hushed tones, the hidden power of the Count's family. Life in Rodmil brought Alan a great deal of satisfaction. Although it had only been about 3 days, life in Rodmil offered him everything he imagined a typical noble life should be. He could wake up whenever he wanted, sleep whenever he wanted, eat whenever he wanted. Rodmil was a place where Alan could effortlessly live out what he believed were the 3 activities that brought the greatest happiness when done freely. While the funeral of Leo Palacio, the eldest son of the Palacio family, was taking place, Alan let out a silent sigh as he looked ahead. Leo lay pale and lifeless, just like Tonio and the late Palacio Count before him. Alan couldn't help but show a somewhat baffled expression. "I have no idea where to even start with this mess." The reason for Alan's confusion was that Leo's death didn't align with how he had envisioned it. Everything seemed to be twisted. Leo's death was supposed to happen 6 years from now. He shifted his gaze to Leo's body, scanning it thoroughly. The wounds were hidden by the ceremonial clothing, but a moonflower. Privacy settings. As per the kingdom's tradition, significant scars or mortal wounds were marked with a blue flower known as a moonflower, which was native to the kingdom. One of these moonflowers was placed over Leo's chest, killed by a sword piercing the heart. While contemplating Leo's cause of death, Alan couldn't help but wonder who had committed such an act. There are plenty of suspects if I think about it. He knew that Leo had been causing trouble in the underworld, doing all sorts of reckless things. It wasn't surprising that something like this could have happened to him. After all, Leo had likely killed over 1,000 people, directly or indirectly. Despite this, Alan kept questioning the situation because he knew Leo's future. Who could it be? Who killed Leo? With these thoughts, Alan looked around. Quite a few people had gathered for Leo's funeral. Servants, retainers, and knights of the Palacio household were present. He had heard that some nobles had visited to pay their respects, but by the time Alan returned, they had already left. In other words, the only people attending the funeral were those who worked for the Palacio family, and they were all trying their best to avoid Alan's gaze. A servant who used to make casual jokes about how Alan would have died on the streets if he'd been born a commoner was now sweating profusely and bowing his head. A knight who had previously picked fights with Alan every time he stepped out of the mansion now deliberately averted his gaze to avoid looking at him. It's understandable that they'd be worried about their jobs now that the third son they mocked has suddenly become the heir of the family. Even so, Alan noticed something more subtle in their reactions that caught his attention. Whenever Alan's gaze landed on a servant, they would tremble slightly, their hands shaking. Earlier, when Alan's eyes met a knight's and he gave a slight shrug, just as he usually did, the knight fumbled and dropped his ceremonial sword, causing an awkward scene in the middle of the funeral. These behaviors made it clear how the servants currently perceived Alan. They're not just suspicious, they're almost certain it was me. 2 hours later. Young master. Yes, privacy settings. It's beyond what I imagined. How bad is it? At this point, you've become the hidden power of the Palacio family. Someone capable of wiping out Avalon in a single day. Alan realized that he had unknowingly become the rumored mastermind, holding immense power within the Palacio family. I was just toasting some bread. Alan's quiet lament as he recalled his time in Rodno, where he had been making a simple piece of toast while such rumors about him spread through the Palacio household. In the time it took you to make that toast, you've become the hidden mastermind controlling sword masters. I'm not in the mood for jokes. I'm not joking, young master. That's truly the rumor going around. How did such a rumor even spread? Alan frowned, utterly baffled by the situation. In response, Evan began explaining the information he had gathered from the guild. A short while later, in summary, a day after Leo's death, Avalon, the organization he controlled, disappeared from the underworld without a trace. Yes, and people think I'm the one responsible. Exactly. Why? Because you're the only one who benefits from this situation, young master. When you put it that way, it does make sense. Indeed, it was a situation where Alan couldn't avoid suspicion. Leo had been killed shortly after Alan left the mansion for Rodmill, and Avalon, the organization Leo managed, was wiped out soon after. In such a scenario, it was obvious that Alan stood to gain the most. He had a perfect alibi, being away in Rodmill, while securing his position as the heir to the Palacio family. Moreover, with Avalon's destruction, the ties to the underworld that had clung to the Palacio family like sticky tar were completely severed. In other words, any influence the underworld might have had to bother Alan was now entirely eliminated. But, are you sure you didn't do it, young master? You were right there with me, buttering the toast. That's true, but everything fell into place so perfectly that I just had to ask. Are you doubting me? Privacy settings. I wouldn't say doubting, but you do sometimes give orders without explaining the reason behind them. Alan fell silent at Evan's words. It was true. Instead of replying, Alan began to think. Are there any groups in the eastern region that could have taken down a major underworld figure, like Avalon? The 100 Ghost Night Parade? No, they won't appear for another 6 years. Then the Root Organization? No, they're based in the east, so they wouldn't have come all the way here. Alan shook his head. No matter how much he thought about it, he couldn't think of any organization capable of wiping out Avalon in an instant. As he was about to abandon his thoughts, a realization struck him. He recalled something Evan had mentioned before and asked, Evan, yes, didn't you mention a group before that hunts other organizations? Oh, you mean the Blue Moon? Yeah, them. Could it be them? Evan shook his head at Alan's question. No, the Information Guild also ruled out the Blue Moon. How can they be sure? The Blue Moon always leaves a mark after their work is done. Also, where the Blue Moon has been, there may be pieces of bodies left behind, but never entire bodies. But that wasn't the case this time. They said it was a hellscape. Most of the organization was cut down with blades. So that's why they think I have a sword master working for me. Exactly. Alan nodded at Evan's explanation. It's true that an organization that couldn't survive 6 years into the future wouldn't be able to eliminate Leo and Avalon. But then, who could it be? It was a night filled with endless contemplation. Any traces left? In the underground of the Eastern Orphanage. As soon as the usual forgathered, the question was asked, and everyone responded in turn. I left nothing behind. Privacy settings. Neither did I. Same here. just as you instructed. I made sure to leave no traces." Rhine, whose green eyes glimmered faintly, continued to speak. "It seems the Information Guild hasn't linked us to what happened at Avalon, and they've identified it as the work of a sword master who created a hellscape." At Deus's words, Yutia remained silent for a moment, as if deep in thought, before speaking. "Still, just to be sure, keep an eye on the Information Guild's activities. As I've said countless times before, you all understand, right? This must never reach him, never." Though Yujia's red eyes glowed fiercely, everyone nodded in agreement without hesitation. "But do we really need to hide it this much?" Deus asked, his usual relaxed smile replaced by a slightly uneasy expression as he observed Yujia's uncharacteristically tense demeanor. After a brief pause, Yutia responded firmly, "Of course we need to hide it." "Why?" In response to Deus's continued questioning, Yujia's red eyes flashed as she answered, "I told you, didn't I? We are his sword. We must not judge or think for ourselves. We must simply be the sword he wields. But a sword thinking for itself, that's not right, is it? But the eldest son of the Count's family targeted him first. So, it doesn't matter. What's wrong is wrong. There was no order, understand? We only move on his command. If he didn't say anything, we don't act, ever." Deus rubbed the roof of his mouth with his dry tongue as he looked into Yujia's eyes. For someone supposedly living in an orphanage, she exuded an aura of dignity and integrity. Yet there was also an overwhelming, undeniable power in her presence. But whenever she spoke of him, something changed within her. Her dignified gaze turned into one of eerie fanaticism, and her noble aura transformed into something savage and monstrous. Thus, Deus couldn't understand. So make sure to erase every trace. Don't disappoint him. How someone like her, with the power and ability to overwhelm everyone present with just her presence, could feel such anxiety and apprehension over something as minor as being found out. "I understand." Despite his lingering doubts, Deus had no intention of voicing them, so he simply nodded in acknowledgement as the conversation drew to a close. Privacy settings. They've arrived. A man entered as the basement door opened. Even in the dark, lightless basement, his hair shone with a radiant silver hue, as if it had captured the light of the moon itself. Just as the boss said, in the predetermined future, he was to become one of the 5 great sins, the sin of obsession. The remaining forces of Avalon, 286 men, laden, his sharp moon-like eyes gleaming, reported, "I cut them all in half and killed them." It had taken only 5 days for the great organization Avalon, which once dominated the eastern region of the Asteria Kingdom, to disappear, leaving only a tattered signboard behind. "But I don't think the job is completely finished." "What do you mean?" "I found additional nobles connected to Avalon." As he spoke, Layden pulled a meticulously folded piece of paper from his chest and placed it on the table in front of him. "The Duke of Alsha's family is involved. It seems they're quite deeply entangled. With ledgers documenting their dealings, there are about 4 individuals, all of whom appear to be the Duke's children. Given how deeply they're involved, they might start asking questions about this incident. What should we do?" After a moment of silence, Yutia, who had been pondering his words, spoke. "You already know what I'm going to say, don't you?" Her red eyes glinted ominously as she murmured, "I see. Then I'll take care of it as quietly as possible." Layden nodded quietly in agreement. Since the funeral of Leo Palacio, Elan had been keeping busy. Aside from investigating Leo's death, which had unfolded differently from the game's plot, there were other matters that demanded his attention, even though he hadn't wanted them. As a result, his days passed by in a whirlwind of activity. About a month after the funeral, he found himself in Estraven, a territory in the southern part of the Asteria Kingdom, rather than at the Palacio estate. The reason was to attend a ball that was held twice a year as a social event. Officially, Alan's presence was to strengthen social ties, but in reality, he had some business to attend to in the territory. However, he did intend to fulfill the official purpose to some extent, with his position as the future Count all but assured in the coming year. Forging connections with other nobles was crucial both for his social standing and for his own convenience. Privacy settings, or so he thought. Elan glanced around the ballroom. A chandelier shaped like a crescent moon illuminated the room beautifully, while the sons and daughters of nobles, dressed in their finest attire, showcased the distinct elegance of high society. The problem was, none of those nobles could even make eye contact with Elan. Elan watched as a young noblewoman immediately bowed her head when their eyes met, and he sighed. realizing that his goal of strengthening social ties was going to be much harder to achieve than he had anticipated. Elan had somewhat expected problems like these to arise. In the game, the Palacio family merely appeared as a stepping stone for the protagonist's growth, but in the Kingdom of Asteria, the weight that the name carried was quite significant. Of course, this status didn't necessarily mean that they were held in high honor, even if, for about 3 generations, they were considered a highly reputable family within the kingdom. The current Count Palacio family was renowned as the most notorious troublemaker among the nobility in the eastern region. To elaborate a bit more, they were known as a noble family that became incredibly bothersome if provoked. However, if there was something Elan overlooked despite being aware of this issue, this wine has a rather unique taste. What? I quite like wine, and this one has a very distinct aroma. I'd love to take a few bottles home. I'll speak to my father and have some brought to you. Pardon. It was that the Palacio family's propensity for trouble far exceeded his imagination. Elan watched the young lady, who shrunk back like a frightened mouse and quickly bowed her head. Before scurrying away, he wore a hollow expression. Privacy settings. Look at that. He's threatening Lady Malantino to forcefully take their specialty wine. Is that so? Just listen to him. It's exactly like when the eldest son of Palacio made threats before. And that wine is a limited edition specialty. As Elan pondered what the problem might be, he heard a small voice and thought to himself with a bitter expression, Leo, that damn troublemaker. Feeling despondent, Elan glanced at the place where the young ladies had been gossiping until just a moment ago. Upon noticing his gaze, they quickly lowered their heads and disappeared somewhere. Elan couldn't comprehend the situation at all. Wasn't it just one of those notorious families in the East? Of course, he could guess that there were negative rumors about the family, and he understood why some nobles might avoid them, but he didn't expect it to be this extreme. More accurately, he hadn't known that the Palacio family was so notoriously ill-reputed among the nobility. He hadn't anticipated being treated this way just because of a misunderstanding about him, bringing down the family's troublemakers. So, does this mean socializing is out of the question? Just as Elan let out a small sigh. Hello. He turned at the voice, only to see a girl in a black dress smiling alluringly at him. Even among the young ladies present at this ball, she stood out for her stunning beauty. Elan greeted her with a return smile. Hello, Lady Zenonia. Oh my, do you know me? Of course. From Alan's perspective, it was impossible not to know her. This was only natural, as the girl standing before him was the eldest daughter of the Zenonia family, who, like the Palacio family, were known for their notoriety in the western region. In 6 years, she wouldn't just be the eldest daughter of the Zenonia family, she would become Countess Zenonia herself. Furthermore, she was one of the 3 major villains the protagonist would confront in the future. In the Kingdom of Asteria, you're quite famous, after all. Famous, you say? Indeed. In short, she was someone he'd rather not get involved with. Seeing the momentary, subtle emotion flicker in Lady Zenonia's eyes, Elan continued. Privacy settings. Because you are so beautiful. Even within Asteria, there were more than a handful of factions. These factions were split into royalists and nobility, both fervently engaged in political struggles. And it wasn't just empty political rhetoric, since real interests were at stake. Politics were a crucial element for the nobles. Of course, Elan hadn't come to the ball to socialize for the sake of politics. Even though it was half-baked, Alan's goal was still to live a peaceful life, and he knew very well that the words peace and politics could never coexist. Nevertheless, the reason he had intended to socialize to some extent was that even minimal connections could be helpful in aristocratic life. Except for this person. Elan looked at Lady Zenonia. The Zenonia family, like the Palacio family, was regarded as a notorious troublemaker in the western region. Unlike the Palacio family, which stayed out of politics to act without consequences, the Zenonia family leveraged political situations to their advantage. In other words, they were a bit more cunning than the Palacio family, perhaps more like a corporate criminal organization. Thank you for the compliment. It's the truth. As a result, one might think that socializing with Lady Zenonia wouldn't be a bad idea if Elan wasn't planning to engage in politics. However, that would be a mistake. People tend to congregate with others like themselves. Politicians attract other politicians, and thugs gather round other thugs. So, if Elan were to forge a connection with Lady Zenonia in such a situation, If he were willing to dabble in illegal activities like those dead Palacio troublemakers, it might be a valuable connection. But if not, it would be an irreversible mistake. In the worst-case scenario, he might even end up becoming one of Lady Zenonia's pawns. Contrary to external rumors of him belonging to a group with a swordmaster, Elan was, in reality, just an ordinary noble with nothing to his name. I'd like to talk more. What do you think? I'd love to, but unfortunately, I think I must leave for today. Is that so? Lady Zenonia's eyes narrowed briefly, exuding a predatory vibe, a look impossible to decipher. However, just for a moment. Privacy settings. The young lady's eyes opened slightly as if she were surprised by something. Then she nodded as if she understood, a smile appearing on her face. Just as the rumors said, "Pardon, it's nothing. I look forward to seeing you again." With those words, she brushed past him. Elan turned around and looked at Lady Zenonia with a puzzled expression. A specialty wine from Malantino, tangerine tea from Pina, crafted metalwork from Valanda, a premium horse from Paldeon. These were the spoils Elan had gathered, instead of making friends. After he resolved to make a few acquaintances since he was already there, socializing is a lost cause. Looking at the list of spoils he had obtained instead of acquaintances, Elan let out a helpless chuckle. I knew it, I shouldn't have studied something like noble hobbies. Recalling the wine studies he had undertaken, hoping it might help with socializing, Elan smacked his lips. He then turned around to do what he had originally intended. Just a moment. HM. Another voice called out to Elan. Hello. Turning his head, Elan saw a woman in a splendid red dress, adorned with various accessories. It seemed she had paid a lot of attention to her appearance, down to the most minute details. However, despite her meticulous appearance, her face held no particular expression. Yes, hello. Facing her, Elan greeted her while noticing how out of place she seemed in her outfit. She promptly asked him a question. If you have a moment, could we talk? Elan looked at her with a slightly surprised expression. There had only been one person who had initiated a conversation with him at this ball. Is she from the same side as Zenonia? Privacy settings. For a brief moment, he recalled a list of villains from the kingdom of Asteria and then nodded. Sure, whatever her intentions might be, she wasn't on the list of villains Elan had in his mind. And, more importantly, she had approached him for a conversation. The two of them stepped out onto the terrace to have a light chat. Soon after, may I ask your name, young lady? Forgive my late introduction. I am Roria, the third daughter of the Duke of Alsha. Ah, the Alsha family. Yes. Elan involuntarily let out a sigh inwardly. The Alsha family was a notorious one from the northern part of Asteria, and like Lady Zenonia, it was a family associated with one of the three major villains, the Duke of Alsha. Then again, it's unlikely that anyone who approaches me would be normal. I should have asked for her name first, Elan thought, realizing how quickly he had grasped his situation from just attending a single ball. But why don't I remember her? Elan looked at Roria's face. Her elaborate adornment only enhanced her already outstanding beauty. With a face like this, there's no way I wouldn't know her. In Psychedelia, every member of the Alsha family was a villain. In other words, if she were a member of the Alsha family, Elan, who had played the game multiple times, should at least remember her name, even if he hadn't memorized her face. That's why, after pondering, Elan asked directly, May I be blunt? What is it? Please lend me your strength. Strength. I am about to be assassinated. At those words, Elan realized one truth. In the game, the total number of Alsha family members he'd seen was 4, the Duke of Alsha, his 2 elder sisters, and 1 younger brother. So, for Roria to be the third daughter, in other words, it meant that Roria was already dead 6 years into the future. My sisters, no, they will try to kill me soon. Privacy settings. Summarizing Roria's story, which started as soon as he realized the truth, it was as follows. She was the daughter of the Duke's only concubine, whom he loved more than his legitimate wife. She had survived up until now because of his favor, however. The Duke of Alsha was now gravely ill and could pass away any day. In other words, the moment the Duke died, so would Roria. Then, why are you asking me for help? With your power, it should be possible. For the first time, her face showed signs of anxiety. I refuse. But even seeing that expression, Elan had no choice but to reject her request. Of course, I'm not asking you to do this for free. If you help me, I will offer you half of the Alsha families. I'm afraid I must decline. Roria's expression was urgent as she spoke. However, Alan's response remained unchanged. It wasn't that he didn't feel sympathy for Roria. Had he possessed the strength, her request would have been worth considering, even if he didn't agree outright. Unfortunately, Elan didn't have that kind of power. Most of the rumors surrounding Elan were untrue. He didn't have an assassin who killed Leo of the Palacio family, nor did he have the strength of a swordmaster that had taken down Avalon. Therefore, I'll be going now. As Elan turned around, he saw the despair flickering in Roria's silent eyes. However, Elan didn't gain any power from seeing that. He was too busy just trying to take care of himself. Thus, as he was about to walk back toward the ballroom, he clicked his tongue and looked back at Roria. Good things will happen. A blessing spoken to lighten his own somber mood. Roria gave no response. Elan didn't expect one, either, as he turned away. I hope we can meet again. It was merely the faint echo of his modern sensibilities that made his heart ache slightly, so he murmured while looking absent-mindedly at the crescent moon-shaped chandelier. To offer some comfort. And then, privacy settings. It would be best to report this part to the Red Moon. On the roof of the ballroom, where the chandelier hung, an observer, stationed to monitor Elan and cut off any information about the Avalon incident if necessary, turned to his side and spoke. There's no need, she's not one of the targets. Even if we do nothing, Layden will handle it. I see. So, she's the only one among Alsha's children who isn't a target for Layden. Yes, in any case, we should focus on other matters. As the observer with green eyes shifted his gaze to another location, Deus also turned his eyes in another direction. There, he saw a black-clad figure quietly tailing Elan. Is it a tail? Deus silently began to gather his mana to deal with the figure. But then he hesitated. He recalled Yudia's order not to act rashly without permission. Thus, let's just watch for now. Deus and Rhine decided to quietly observe the black-clad figure following Elan. Alan's ostensible reason for coming to the Estravan territory was to build connections, however. The real reason he endured a journey of over a week to get here was because of a labyrinth, located to the south of Estravan. Is this the place where you said you had some business? Yes, it took us 2 weeks to find this place, but there's nothing here. As Evan slowly scanned the empty forest, he spoke. Elan also looked around. Indeed, the only things around were an unpaved road and forest that seemed to have been neglected for a long time. There were no features that stood out. That's why I had to go through so much trouble for 2 weeks. Alan's face remained expressionless, but he let out a sigh of relief inwardly. After the ball, Elan had spent nearly 20 days in Estravan, investing his time in finding this labyrinth. I took it too lightly just because it was easy to find in the game. Thinking that, Elan shifted his gaze to a small ravine visible beyond the forest. He began to walk toward the only clue that had allowed him to find the labyrinth. Are you sure this time? Having already wasted 2 trips, Evan grumbled as he followed Elan. Sensing Evan's footsteps behind him, Elan quickly organized his thoughts. The name of the labyrinth is the Whispering Labyrinth. It's a labyrinth accessible around the middle of the game, and the reward for clearing it is the item called Constraint. Once I get that, my business in the labyrinth will be done. Privacy settings. Recalling the characteristics of the labyrinth he had visited hundreds of times in Psychedelia, Elan walked without hesitation. Soon, he arrived at a small ravine beyond the forest. This place looks strange no matter how you look at it. Evan spoke as soon as they reached the ravine. Just as he murmured, the ravine was small, but it had an unmistakable sense of wrongness. Despite the sun hanging high in the sky, the interior of the ravine was excessively dark, as if it were repelling the sunlight. This triggered a sense of alarm and caution in Evan. Let's go, young master. But instead, this phenomenon filled Elan with joy. The effect in the ravine was identical to the field effect of the Whispering Labyrinth he was searching for. This meant that the Whispering Labyrinth was indeed here, so he stepped into the dark ravine without hesitation. Evan watched Elan with a shocked expression, but had no choice but to follow him inside. Entering the ravine felt like the presence of the sun a moment ago was a lie. The interior was shrouded in darkness. In the darkness, various stones, carved with what seemed to be artificial patterns rather than natural formations, could be seen scattered around. Walking past these, Elan soon spotted an entrance submerged in pitch-black darkness. Elan stood staring blankly at the door, which was undoubtedly artificially constructed, covered with various patterns. How did you know this place existed? Because I've been here often. What? Realizing he had made a slip of the tongue, Elan quickly corrected himself. It was a joke. A joke. With that face, it didn't sound like a joke at all. So how did you know about it? I have my ways. For someone with ways, it did take you quite some time to find this place. I didn't expect it to take this long either. As Alon briefly recalled playing psychedelia, Evan asked another question. So, who made this unpleasant place? It was made by a fellow named Paleon. The Whispering Labyrinth. Privacy settings. Alon recalled that in some online communities, it was also referred to as Paleon's Water Rocket Labyrinth. Paleon, you say? Let's go in. Without answering any more of Evan's questions, Alon walked toward the labyrinth entrance, and Evan, looking nervous and cautious, followed him. Soon, no one was left at the entrance of the labyrinth. Screech, crack, crackle, crunch. A hell gargoyle, which would only be defeatable around the mid-story progression of psychedelia, was being slowly crushed to death as if caught in a massive stone press that had fallen from the ceiling. Evan looked on with a pale face. Oh, watching such a powerful monster, which he could never defeat alone, die in such a futile and gruesome way was enough to leave a mark on his normally stoic disposition, honed by years as a mercenary. However, what made Evan's heart pound even more was the realization that the massive stone currently crushing the hell gargoyle hung above their heads as well. How can the young master be so calm in this situation? Evan looked at Alon. Despite the fact that failing to solve even one puzzle in this labyrinth would lead to a brutal death like the gargoyles, Alan's face remained expressionless. He seemed to be waiting for the door to open, completely unfazed by the situation. Seeing Alon like this only intensified Evan's curiosity about him. Usually, no matter how inscrutable a magician might be, 4 years together would reveal at least a little of their true nature. Moreover, Evan had helped Alon with many things over the past 4 years. Sometimes he saved orphans. Sometimes he took down evil organizations. Other times, he helped a slave girl or paid off an old man's debt. If not, he'd deliver messages with no apparent meaning to acquaintances. He dealt with all sorts of tasks. Yet, despite handling all these tasks, Evan still didn't know Alon. This was because none of the tasks Alon had assigned provided any clues about his true intentions. The closest thing to a common thread was that Alon seemed to take a sustained interest in some of the children he had saved, sending them to orphanages. Apart from that, there was much Evan didn't know about Alon. Privacy settings. For example, how Alon knew about such a place despite never having left the Palacio estate, or how he understood the workings of this eerie labyrinth and could confidently answer its questions. Nevertheless, despite the suspicions he harbored, Evan had developed a peculiar trust in Alon, which was enough for him to follow Alon into this suspicious place, partly due to the fact that all the tasks Alon had undertaken ultimately led to good outcomes. What exactly is he preparing? But even with this trust, his curiosity wasn't fading. Evan looked at Alon with eyes mixed with admiration and intrigue as Alon inspected his surroundings. With an indifferent expression, I think I'm going to be sick. In truth, Alon was forcibly averting his gaze to avoid watching the gargoyle being crushed horribly. I knew it was gruesome, but not this much. Screech. Alon confirmed the door opening as soon as the gargoyle's execution concluded and let out a sigh. Even though he wasn't capable of proper combat, the reason he confidently entered the Whispering Labyrinth, accessible only round the mid-game, was because he knew about this labyrinth. Thanks to that, I cleared it easily. This labyrinth consisted of 8 rooms, each requiring him to solve a puzzle before progressing to the next. Knowing all the puzzles in this labyrinth meant he wouldn't need to fight any enemies, and Alon remembered every puzzle precisely. No, from the perspective of a psychedelia player, the puzzles in this labyrinth were unforgettable. This was one of the few labyrinths where one could re-enter repeatedly, without collecting the rewards, making it ideal for grinding levels. Naturally, Alon, who had always used this place for mid-game grinding over countless playthroughs, had memorized all the puzzles and reached the end of the labyrinth with ease, dragging along Evan, who was utterly exhausted despite no combat having taken place. Alon entered a small room at the end of the labyrinth, where he picked up a ring lying on an old table in the center. It was a plain-looking ring, so unremarkable that some might openly express disappointment, sensing no power from it. However, Alon smiled. He was sure the item he held was the constraint he had been looking for. He also didn't mind the ring's lack of a flashy appearance. Young master, that ring you were holding just. In the first place, this item didn't function as an artifact. It was more like an elixir that would be absorbed into the user's body the moment it was used. Privacy settings. Now that we've got what we need, let's go. As the ring disappeared from Alan's hand, Evan, who had been surprised, saw Alan turning around as if he had finished everything he needed to do. Evan, still looking dumbfounded, quickly followed Alan out of the room, and, as soon as they reached the exit, the labyrinth shut down entirely. As if everything had concluded, Alan and Evan, who had escaped safely, found themselves facing something unexpected. Did you foresee this as well? As soon as they exited the labyrinth, they were confronted by human-shaped golems holding weapons, standing in formation. They hadn't been there just moments ago. These golems are the stone piles we saw earlier. Realizing that these golems were the countless stone piles they had passed earlier, Evan tense, drew his sword. I'll handle this. Huh? Evan responded with a puzzled expression to Alan's words. Before he could even ask a question, the constraint is now in effect. The pronouncement came from Alan's lips. Seated in the carriage heading back to the Alsha Duke's estate, Roria let out a deep sigh, her face filled with profound despair as she looked at the estate in the distance. She gave a self-deprecating smile. As I expected, I was a fool. Roria thought of the man she had met at the ball, Elan, the third son of the Palacio family, but that was only his public identity. According to the rumors circulating among the nobility, he had killed his two older brothers, who were major figures in the underworld, and had even wiped out Avalon, which had been almost ruling the eastern region overnight. He was the true mastermind of the Palacio family, hiding his power and waiting for the right time to reveal his claws. No, it's not just rumors. Having met Alan, Roria knew without a doubt that those rumors were true. The emotional restraint he had displayed at the ball could never have come from someone ordinary. It was almost like looking at father. Roria thought of her father, the Duke of Alsha, known as the noble one among the aristocracy because he could manipulate both the royalists and the nobility factions within the kingdom at his will, and someone who should never be crossed. Privacy settings. Her father, who never revealed his emotions carelessly and always remained cool-headed in his judgments. The eyes of her father resembled those of Alan, whom she had seen 5 days ago. That's why Roria had clung to Alan, realizing he was her last lifeline, and she had failed. Honestly, she hadn't been surprised by the outcome. The moment she saw Alan's eyes, Roria had realized that he was not someone who would be swayed by petty sympathy or pity. Yet, she still pleaded for sympathy and pity, because she had nothing else to offer. What she did have was just a semblance of power maintained by the Duke's mercy and affection. No matter how hard she tried to grasp something more, her efforts were always thwarted by those who could hardly be called her kin, her contemptible relatives. In other words, she was powerless, and thus, unable to seize her last lifeline. Or rather, she was the only one who thought it was a lifeline. There wouldn't be anyone willing to engage in a transaction where the risks were more apparent than the benefits. In truth, it would be a lie to say she didn't know. Even if it was just a semblance of power, she had already been through numerous situations, fighting against her despicable relatives who had everything, trying to secure her position. So, even though she hadn't yet reached adulthood, her mind was already well versed in the world's logic. She understood all too well that every relationship and story carried both gains and losses. Good things will happen. As Roria gazed out of the window at the scenery of the estate, she recalled those seemingly meaningless words Alan had said at the end. About 30 minutes later, when she returned to the mansion, "What did you say? Lady Phelan and Lord Kig have passed away." She heard from a maid that 2 of her siblings, who had tormented her so much, had taken their own lives. Hearing this news, Roria, looking perplexed, went to her room, feeling baffled by their deaths. Her detestable family members were more likely to stab each other in the back than commit suicide. In other words, the fact that those 2 had committed suicide made no sense from the beginning. Privacy settings. This is absurd. Certain that some scheme was at play, Roria suddenly remembered the words of that man, the third son of the Palacio family. No, good things will happen. Recalling the words of the true mastermind who had killed all his siblings and ascended to become the heir of the Count's family, she felt a chill run down her spine. Kalia, the eldest daughter of the Zenonia territory, had just arrived at the estate and reached the study where the Count was. She found herself once again thinking about a man she had recalled numerous times, Alan Palacio, who had recently killed all his brothers in the Count's family and secured the position of heir. Famous, indeed. Kalia recalled the look in the man's eyes as he had gazed at her, eyes that revealed nothing, as if peering into an abyss beyond the northern lands. indifferent to everything. No matter how many times she thought about it, those eyes sent chills down her arms. Through those eyes, Kalia realized something, that he was the same kind as herself. In truth, if that were all, Kalia would have stopped thinking about him once he had rejected her proposal. Rejecting her proposal essentially meant that they could not be allies, which in turn implied that they were now adversaries. Despite this, Kalia's curiosity persisted, all because of something he had said. Famous, he said. The Zenonia family is certainly famous, even if they didn't involve themselves in politics. The financial and physical power the Zenonia family wielded was strong enough to overturn the current state of the kingdom at least once. However, that renown ultimately belonged to the Count of Zenonia himself, not to the Zenonia family as a whole, and certainly not to Kalia. Yet Alan had spoken of it. Privacy settings. He had referred to her so clearly and distinctly, in a situation where far more nobles had never seen her face, having only attended balls twice. He had called her famous. Not the Count of Zenonia, but her. Of course, Alan had said this without much thought, recalling her fame as a villain when the original storyline began. But to her, those words held great importance. How intriguing. Kalia turned her gaze toward the Count, seated in the study. The Count was simply processing paperwork in silence. His head was bowed as if she wasn't even there, focused solely on his work. Click, click. As Kalia walked over to the Count, his eyes naturally rose to meet hers. The same red eyes as hers stared back at her. Though he said nothing, the Count's appearance was brimming with vitality. Snap. At least until Kalia snapped her fingers once. As soon as the snapping sound echoed, the light vanished from the Count's eyes. The eyes that had been so sharp a moment ago turned vacant like those of an idiot, and his tightly closed mouth drooped open, drool trickling out. The Count was in a state that clearly wasn't normal. Kalia mumbled as she stared at him. How did he know? No one was supposed to know. Kalia's expression was filled with curiosity as she thought of Alan, who had spoken as if he knew the secret she had kept hidden, since she turned her father into an imbecile. Or maybe he was just taking a shot in the dark. With such doubts in mind, Kalia left the study, where she had been performing her ongoing act for the past 5 years. Kalia, my lady, what's wrong? There's a corpse in your room. At the sudden outburst, Kalia quickly made her way to her room. And there, she saw it. The informant she had placed on Alan 2 weeks ago lay dead, his head twisted around twice, his eyes open wide, unable to find peace even in death. Privacy settings. It seems the seal didn't activate, so it doesn't appear he revealed any secrets. This was the report from one of the knights. The informant didn't leak any secrets, yet they brought his body into my room. Reflecting on this, Kalia let out a sigh. She felt her suspicions turn into a certainty. Looks like he found a big weakness of mine right after we met, she murmured with a smile. Evan grimaced as he looked at the golems glowing bright red in the darkness of the night. Having worked as a mercenary for over 15 years since childhood, his eyes moved busily, trying to locate the golem's weak points, yet he couldn't hide his anxiety. He was confident in his skills, but precisely because of that, he was even more cautious of the unknown entities before him. He had experienced firsthand just how much danger something unknown could pose. Moreover, he had someone to protect at the moment. Facing unknown enemies whose characteristics he didn't even know was the worst-case scenario. To make matters worse, the number of enemies appeared to be easily over 20. As Evan pondered how to handle the situation, "I'll handle this." He responded absent-mindedly to the sudden voice, watching as Alan, without him realizing it, stepped forward. His expression was as indifferent as it had been when they entered the labyrinth. Evan found Alan incredibly mysterious and intriguing all over again. He was genuinely puzzled at how his master could maintain such an expression even in this situation. At least from Evan's perspective, the current situation was quite a crisis. In front of them were over 20 human-shaped golems that clearly needed to be dealt with, and it was certain that each one of them possessed considerable combat power. Yet, even in such a situation, Alan had stepped forward, saying he would handle them. To speak honestly about his thoughts, Evan didn't believe that Alan could deal with the golems before them. Of course, Evan knew that Alan was no ordinary person, and that he had a talent for magic. He had become a respectable magician, reaching the 2nd rank through self-study without a mentor. Privacy settings. However, impressive as that might be by general standards, it didn't mean that such accomplishments would be enough for this kind of situation. While it was true that he had reached the 2nd rank through his own efforts at a young age, Even a mere golem in front of him would be difficult to handle with just that level of power. Blood. As soon as these thoughts crossed his mind, the golems, which had been standing still, as if assessing their targets, suddenly moved and started rushing toward Alan. And then, I enact the constraint. Alan's voice resounded like a declaration. As Alan murmured the incantation, the world seemed to come to a halt. His vision turned black and white, and the movements of the golems charging at him felt as though they were being recorded by a high-speed camera. And then, a fragment inheriting the great will of Nyakula. State the 2 constraints you wish to impose. A grand voice that seemed to shake the entire space echoed in his mind. It sounded both like a man and a woman, a child and an old person. As he heard it, a brief cold sweat ran down Alan's face. As expected, it's different from the game. The artifact called constraint that Alan obtained from the Whispering Labyrinth was just as its name suggested. It imposed limitations on the user, in exchange for an equivalent reward. Once activated, numerous options would appear before him. A notification window would prompt him to choose what constraints to impose, and what rewards to receive. However, reminding him that this was indeed reality, what appeared before him was not a notification window, but a voice that, just by listening to it, made his head spin and his heart race, filling him with an unsettling sense of dread as if his heart might explode at any moment. Letting out a deep sigh, Alan forcibly steadied his trembling heart and voiced the constraints he had in mind. 1. State your constraint. The use of magic requires the absolute execution of Babylonian hand signs. What do you wish to gain from this? Power that can slightly twist the laws of the world. Granted. Privacy settings. And one more. State your constraint. The use of magic requires the limited execution of the great Babylonian incantations. What do you wish to gain from this? The same as before. Following Alan's words, the voice fell silent for a moment. The slow-moving foot of a golem lifted into the air and then returned to the ground. Alan wondered if he had made a mistake. I accept. As if dispelling his concerns, the majestic voice from the heavens spoke words of affirmation. To you, who remember the hand signs and mysteries of a forgotten great god, I offer my gratitude for inheriting the will. The voice conveyed this message to Alan. Alan's expression turned puzzled at this. Although his face remained expressionless outwardly, Alan's eyes were full of questions. Inheriting the will, what does that mean? Naturally, Alan had no clue about any of that. The reason he chose the Babylonian hand signs and incantations as his constraints was simple. In the game, these 2 choices provided the highest possible magic attack power in return. Moreover, he had chosen these constraints so often that he had naturally memorized the Babylonian hand signs and incantations. Of course, he wasn't a genius, so he hadn't memorized all the signs and incantations he'd seen in the game, but he didn't feel burdened by it. Alan knew where the Babylonian hand signs and incantations were written. Therefore, while the voice from the heavens puzzled Alan, it was only for a moment. I will always be watching, you, who inherit the will. As Alan realized that the black and white world was gradually returning to its original state, he recognized that reality had resumed. He raised his hand to test the constraints while observing the golems charging at him from a distance. At the same time, mana began to flow from Alan's body, coursing through his heart and gathering at his raised fingertips. Privacy settings. The mana gathered at his fingertips was faint, even though he was drawing on all the mana his body possessed. The orb of lightning, which should have been shining brightly according to the description in the book, only emitted a dim glow, like the last light of a dying old man. However, Alan felt neither disappointment nor surprise. He was acutely aware that this was the limitation of Alan, the 3rd son of the Palacio family. Nonetheless, refraction. The moment he uttered those words, matching his recitation, rebound, the small orb distorted into chaotic lines. Blue light. With a crackling sound, it began to emit a blue light. The small orb transformed into hundreds, thousands of lines, creating a non-linear light source that sparked and crackled. A light source that emitted a blue glow so cold it almost hurt to look at. Simultaneously, Alan formed a hand sign. His thumb covered his middle finger. It was a stance resembling the gesture used to flick one's forehead. However, Alan flipped his hand around, forming a posture reminiscent of the Buddha's Dharma wheel gesture. With that, he looked at the golem that had already reached him and declared the final incantation. Linear diffraction. When the blue light momentarily banished the darkness, snap! He snapped his fingers, and a flash of light was released. Fwoosh! There was no sound. All that could be heard was the faint whooshing noise following the flash, and what could be seen were the golems frozen as if time had stopped after the dazzling light illuminated the ravine. And then, crack crackle, the dozens of golems collapsed without any resistance, crumbling into piles of stones. Evan, who had been rushing to fend off the golems attacking Alan, stood there with his mouth agape, stunned. What in the world? Privacy settings, he muttered, disbelief clear in his voice. After dealing with the golems, were you hiding your power all this time? Evan, who had returned to the area where the carriage was and was preparing for camp, couldn't suppress his curiosity any longer and asked, "No, not at all." Then, was that really second-rank magic? Yes. Evan wore a look of disbelief at Alan's response. I see. However, having realized that no matter how much he asked, he wouldn't get more answers from Alan, Evan sighed and nodded, signaling he understood. He then continued his preparations for the camp. Watching Evan, Alan kept his outward expression neutral, though he felt somewhat wronged. After all, Alan himself had no idea why the magic he had just performed turned out the way it did. I knew that using constraints would make me stronger to some extent, but the combat in Psychedelia, the game Alan had played, was turn-based, not real-time. In the game, the hand signs and incantations were used to enhance magic damage by consuming turns. Depending on the magic being used, the appropriate hand signs would strengthen the spell itself. By selecting the correct incantations from hundreds of options within a limited time, the attributes of the spell could be enhanced. Privacy settings. For example, in the magic he used this time, known as chain lightning in Psychedelia, he used for specific incantations, refraction, rebound, blue light, and linear diffraction. By using these for incantations and hand signs, he enhanced the spell chain lightning. Additionally, he placed a constraint on himself to always use hand signs and incantations when casting magic, thus further strengthening the spell. In other words, Alan had expected the magic to be more than twice as powerful as usual, but it wasn't supposed to be this strong. In Psychedelia, using a hand sign or incantation consumed one turn each, so the spell Alan had used this time would have been prepared over the course of 5 turns in game terms. Even considering that, is it really enough to overkill the golems? As Alan pondered this, he shrugged his shoulders. In truth, regardless of the specifics, the outcome had gone well according to his plans, and having the magic be more powerful than expected was a good thing. In fact, beyond simply being pleased, Alan's mind was now filled with curiosity. I wish I could experiment a bit if I could. The hand signs and incantations Alan used this time were ones commonly employed in Psychedelia, when raising the protagonist as a glass cannon mage, intended for easily handling large-scale enemy encounters with powerful lightning magic. This meant that Alan had at least 10 more incantations and hand signs still intact in his memory, that he hadn't used today. Moreover, the reason Alan's curiosity was particularly piqued was due to the noticeable changes in the magic. Each time he uttered an incantation. In the game, the incantations merely increased damage by 10% whenever the correct type of incantation was chosen. But here, it's different. Perhaps an ordinary magician wouldn't have noticed, but Alan, who had personally performed the magic and possessed a unique talent for mana control, had observed the magic's attributes changing each time an incantation was added. It wasn't just the power increasing, the very nature of the mana itself altered with each incantation. Therefore, I should conduct some experiments once my mana recovers. Alan closed his eyes inside the carriage, feeling good, even if his expression remained neutral. And at that moment, a girl appeared at the place where Alan had used magic, where only the piles of stones remained that could no longer become golems. A girl with eyes gleaming in a deep green. Privacy settings. No, the one who might have been called Rhine of Greed in the future silently passed by the stone heaps that had once been golems and looked at the door Alan had entered earlier. The door was cracked and worn, but the carvings on its frame emphasized that it was man-made, not a natural formation. However, Rhine knew that the carvings on this door's frame weren't meaningless. Born with a great mission and the innate ability to access the ancient library at any time, she could understand what was inscribed on the frame. From the forgotten age of foreign gods, the script of the Alanif Empire. Recognizing this, Rhine read the words carved into the frame. From Paleon to the friend left alone. Ha! Rhine involuntarily let out a hollow laugh as she read the inscription. She knew that there was only one person who used the name Paleon in ancient texts. The Great Paleon. the one who had repelled the invasions of the Black Ones multiple times during the Age of Foreign Gods, and who had defeated the Alakalaka, a being that could make subjects offer their hearts just by looking at it. The noble, revered, great, and glorious emperor. Knowing that Paleon, as written in ancient language, referred to this one person, she couldn't help but chuckle. Simultaneously, it was made by a fellow named Paleon. Rhine recalled Alan's voice as she gazed at the outer frame of the wall with a blank, somewhat melancholic expression. The image of the great moon silently watching over the frame surfaced in her mind, and a hypothesis began to cloud her thoughts. Negation and affirmation clashed in her mind, and the scales tipped towards denial. However, what next came to mind was the magic Alan had demonstrated after emerging from the labyrinth. His magic hadn't seemed particularly exceptional, but the incantations he muttered were different. The incantations the great moon whispered were things that didn't even exist in the ancient library. Recalling this, the scales that had been tipping now came to rest evenly balanced. Even though I knew that anyone the red moon would follow must be no ordinary person, her thoughts finally reached the identity of the one leading the blue moon, and the scale within her mind finally tipped to the truth. Privacy settings. That the great moon, Paleon's close friend, was someone worthy of both respect and reverence. Realizing this, she felt a chill run down her spine as she looked toward where Alan was, as the distinct light of respect began to shine in her eyes, which had until now moved only by the command of the red moon. You've returned. Rhine turned her gaze slightly at the sense of an approaching presence, and there stood Deus, who had appeared without notice, nodding his head as his eyes gleamed. Yes, did you gather any information? Rhine recalled how, a week ago, Deus had stopped monitoring Alan, and instead followed the black-clad figure as it retreated, and asked him. He shook his head. No, I wasn't able to get any information. Why not? Deus began to explain what had happened when he chased after the black-clad figure, responding to Rhine's questioning tone. And then, are you saying that the black-clad figure died while you were pursuing them? Yes, in empty air. Their neck twisted around twice, and they died instantly. I didn't sense anything at all. Rhine fell silent for a moment at Deus's words. I think we should report this. I agree. After muttering these words, they exchanged a few more lines before disappearing from the spot. Finally, the only thing that remained there was the lonely moonlight. 2 months had passed since Alan obtained the constraint from the Whispering Labyrinth. Currently, Alsha was experiencing a period of great turmoil. There were 3 reasons for this. The first was the sudden death of Gig, the second son of the Duke's family, and Phelan, the second daughter. The second reason was that Duke Alsha, who had been suffering from illness and was predicted to have little time left, had finally passed away. The third reason was that Timalion, the eldest son of the Duke's family, was found dead a day after the Duke's death, alongside his elder sister, Malion, and they had both stabbed each other to death. Due to this chain of events, all the children who could inherit the Duke's title vanished overnight. As a result, Roria became the sole heir to the Duke's family. Privacy settings. Just like Count Palacio had done not long ago, Roria, who never thought she would ever sit in the Duke's study, now found herself quietly swallowing a breath there in just 2 short months. Rumors about Roria had already begun to spread within the Duke's family. However, amusingly, despite the quiet circulation of these rumors, she hadn't suffered any harm. She had a clear alibi. When the second son and daughter died, she had just returned from a ball, and the eldest son and daughter had killed each other. Moreover, she hadn't had any recent meetings with them, and most importantly, the reason she could avoid all suspicion was that, during her absence at the ball, her organization had been completely destroyed. That's right. By the time she returned from the ball, she had lost all her power due to her damned family. Because of this, Roria was not being questioned in any of the procedural investigations. Even though rumors were quietly spreading, the work had been executed so cleanly and perfectly. Good things will happen. Roria recalled those words once again. Those words, uttered so nonchalantly, had led to events that were anything but indifferent. She was already certain that everything that had happened was due to him. If anyone claimed these events were mere coincidences, they'd have to be considered lacking in intelligence due to how contrived everything seemed. What does he want? Roria recalled her conversation with Alan. Although he had outwardly rejected her request, he had handled everything more decisively than anyone else could have, and even a month after all the heirs of the Duke's family were dead, he had made no contact. Not even after she had absorbed her decapitated organizations with minimal losses. Pure goodwill. Roria smiled at the fleeting thought. It was absurd, even for her, to entertain such nonsense. After much contemplation, Roria reached one conclusion. Elan had some sort of plan. Of course, Roria didn't know what that plan was, but she had a vague understanding of one thing: privacy settings. That plan requires the Alsha dukedom, someone capable of killing the members of the duke's family without leaving a trace, and so naturally wanted something he didn't have. Roria believed that what he wanted was most likely the renown of the Alsha dukedom, and what he could do with that renown. Roria closed her mouth tightly. It was only then that she realized just how absurd a pact she had made with the devil. Realizing this, Roria let out a hollow laugh but clenched her fist tightly. She knew that once a pact was made, there was no turning back. She understood too well what would happen if she broke the pact, having witnessed the fate of her four predecessors. Therefore, she didn't even consider betrayal. Instead, she decided to focus on the task at hand. I should at least send a thank you. For the first time, a smile appeared on her usually expressionless face. A smile even she was unaware of. A week later, a bottle of wine and a card arrived at the Count's study for Elan. The wine was from Cernance, an imperial territory, produced only 3 bottles a year, and each bottle was worth thousands of gold. Along with it came a card inscribed with words of respect. Elan, looking at the card that came with it, wore a puzzled expression. And 2 months after that. So, you're saying Roria, the third of the Alsha family, has become the Duke of Alsha? Yes, Alsha Roria. That's correct. Is there a problem, young master? Elan began to realize that something was amiss. It had been for months since hearing the news that Roria had become the Duke of Alsha. Now, only 5 years remained until the original story was set to begin. The world, once blanketed in white by winter, was gradually transitioning into spring, a season that brought with it a lethargic drowsiness to all living things. Young master, no, perhaps I should call you Count now. I haven't had the succession ceremony yet. Although Elan hadn't formally held the succession ceremony, he had begun to use the title of Count Palacio for himself, rather than the heir to the Count's family. Even so, you're effectively the Count now, aren't you? It's quite emotional to see you become the Count. Is that so? Elan gave a faint smile, a bitter one at that. It's something I never planned for, actually. Alan's original intention was not to become a Count, but to live a leisurely life as a noble, with the title serving only as a means to an end. However, due to the unexpected assassination of Leo, who was supposed to be the Count, Elan found himself in this position. My goals have changed, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. For Elan, spending his time in Rodmill dabbling in magic research and baking bread wasn't a bad life. Still, being a Count came with its own perks. The title of Count allowed him to enjoy the peaceful noble life he originally envisioned in a more detailed and luxurious manner. Of course, with the increase in the quality of life came added responsibilities. But having dealt with minor tasks as the heir of the Count's family over the past 6 months, Elan found his work-life balance to be quite satisfactory. Privacy settings. I never thought being part of a rogue noble family would be so helpful. Typically, nobles are busy due to the territories they manage, but politics play a much larger role in their hectic lives. However, in the case of Count Palacio, since the family had not involved itself in politics, they could lead a leisurely life unless something urgent arose. Furthermore, while the assassins who dealt with Avalon had indeed taken care of them cleanly, they left behind all the money they had accumulated. This meant that unless he indulged in excessive luxury, the wealth they had amassed would be enough to last for 5 years. Ah, by the way, have you found any new information? If you're referring to information about the assassins who killed Leo. When Elan nodded, Evan shook his head. It seems even the Information Guild is taking this matter seriously, as they're conducting a meticulous investigation, but nothing has been uncovered yet. I see. At Evan's words, Elan clicked his tongue in slight irritation. He wasn't investigating the assassins to exact revenge on Leo's murderers. The reason he continued the investigation was that the past he knew was gradually diverging from what he remembered. The butterfly effect, I suppose I should call it that. I had anticipated some changes. Elan had already expected that the past would change due to the actions he had taken. After all, he had intervened here and there to prevent the occurrence of troublesome events in the future, as well as to secure the 5 sins. Even a small flap of a butterfly's wings can create a storm, and the things he did were on a scale far greater than the flap of a small butterfly's wings. They were enough to create a hurricane. It's only natural that the past would change. though there are some changes I don't fully understand, aside from the fact that he officially became a count. Elan recently recalled one significant change in the future. Roria, who had become the Duke of Alsha 6 months ago, was originally supposed to be dead. Yet she not only survived, but also became the Duke of Alsha, and her influence in the underworld was growing rapidly. Elan wondered which of his interventions had caused this change in the future, where she was supposed to die but instead lived and rose to power. After pondering for a moment, he shrugged, realizing it was pointless to think about it any further. Instead, he shifted his focus back to the assassins who had killed Leo. That's enough. Stop the investigation. Is that really okay? There's still some curiosity that hasn't been satisfied. But if the Information Guild can't uncover anything, then there's no point in continuing. There was another reason why Elan decided to stop the investigation. He'd been pursuing for nearly a year. In this world, some knowledge is better left unknown. Besides, things seem rather ominous. The Information Guild in this world holds at least a little information on everything, largely because its owner and guildmaster is the leader of the Knights and Darkness. As far as Elan knew, only a few organizations could escape the Information Guild's network. Knowing this, Elan realized that there was nothing to gain from uncovering their identities. After all, the more you dig, the more assassins would come to silence you. Privacy settings. In the end, Elan decided to abandon his search for information. His goal was to prepare for any unforeseen circumstances, but he realized there was no need to bring more danger upon himself by acquiring knowledge. That would only increase the threat to his life. Besides, if Leo was attacked by a group that the Information Guild couldn't even identify, then they wouldn't likely target me. Secret organizations usually don't make a move unless their identity is exposed, or someone directly interferes with their activities. They were excessively obsessed with maintaining secrecy. Understood. Evan nodded, turning to leave the office. However, as if suddenly remembering something, he returned and handed Elan a letter. It was a letter from Utia. I brought it with me to give you a report as well. Nodding briefly, Elan unfolded the letter and began to read. The letter contained updates on the orphanage's daily life recently. Whenever he read Utia's letters, Elan felt a warm sensation in his heart without even realizing it. It was no wonder, as Utia's letters, which arrived monthly, were filled with the mundane details of life at the orphanage. Alongside the activities of the Five Sins, these letters had a way of warming his heart. Lately, Deus has been performing puppet shows frequently, and Seolrang is engrossed in games with friends. Additionally, there were stories about Ryan quietly reading books and making things, while Layden had taken a liking to landscaping. These tales naturally brought a fatherly smile to his face. Of course, he hadn't personally raised the Five Sins, nor had he ever met them face to face. But after nearly 5 years of supporting them and watching them grow, he couldn't help but feel this way. I think it's about time to send them out into the world. Elan was considering the idea of releasing the Five Sins from the orphanage. Evan. Yes, Count. How old is Utia? No. How old are the Five Sins now? Let's see, Utia should be 19 by now. And the others? The ones you personally brought in should be around that age as well. Ryan is 17. And Layden is probably 20 now. But why are you asking about their ages all of a sudden? I'm thinking it's time to send them out. Those kids, well, I suppose it does seem a bit late for them to still be at the orphanage. Unlike the modern world, in this world, 16 was considered the age at which one became an adult and began participating in society. Understanding Alan's reasoning, Evan nodded in agreement. But didn't you gather them for a reason? Well, I did, but that doesn't mean I plan to keep them forever. Privacy settings. The reason Elan had gathered the Five Sins was to prevent them from awakening as the Five Sins, who would destroy many kingdoms in the future. In other words, once they were sufficiently cared for, there was no longer a reason to keep them confined to the orphanage. Besides, if I place them in the right positions, each of them should be able to secure a place for themselves. Elan recalled the talents that each of the Five Sins possessed. He remembered the typical boss battle narration that exaggerated the strength of bosses in games. Uja excels in faith, Deus in swordsmanship, Ryan in research. While the exact extent of their talents wasn't clearly defined, Elan was confident they would manage well on their own. As he began to write letters to them, he decided to include a small gift for each, as they were about to venture out into the world. Since I was planning to give them these gifts eventually, I might as well do it now. After spending considerable time writing letters to the five, Elan sealed them and handed them to Evan, who then left to deliver the letters. Watching Evan's departing figure, Elan smiled quietly, thinking, if things go well, maybe I'll reap some benefits too. A few weeks later, in the basement of the orphanage in the eastern region, the 5 who had each received a letter from Elan gathered to read them. The first to speak after reading his letter was Deus. The great moon commands me to head to the Caliburn, the land of nights, to the colony in the desert. Ugh, I hate the desert. I'm to go to the labyrinth city Lartania. I'm assigned to the pleasure city, Raxus. As they read their letters, each of them mumbled to themselves Seolrang, Rhine, and Laden among them. And then, the holy kingdom of Rosario. Muttering as she read her letter, Yuja caught Deus's attention, who spoke with a somewhat puzzled expression. What could be the purpose behind sending us to these places? Didn't it say in your letter, Deus? Well, the letter did say to become a knight in Caliburn, but I'm not sure why I should become a knight. Deus muttered, still confused by the innocent comment from Seolrang. I've told you before, Deus, we don't need to understand, we just need to follow. At Yuja's words, Deus nodded. And besides, we'll understand the reason once we get there. The letters clearly state what we need to do first, right? As Yuja spoke, they all looked at their letters again. Indeed, the letters not only instructed them on what professions to pursue, but also mentioned that they would continue to receive support, along with the location of a gift from the Great Moon. Privacy settings. So, with Yuji's final words, just remember, everyone, don't ever mention the blue moon anywhere unless he speaks of it first. The 5 sins who were destined to become the 5 sins now members of the blue moon, departed to follow Alan's instructions. 3 months later. Count, did you know, Deus has been knighted in Caliburn? Really? Elan, who was researching the ancient language of Babylonia, first heard the news about Deus from Evan, and another 3 months later. Count, what is it? Deus has established a knight order. A knight order? Yes. Hasn't it only been 2 months since he was knighted? And isn't creating a knight order something only an expert or above can do? That's right. He's brimming with talent. I think so too. The fact that word of his deeds has spread so quickly suggests that things are quite lively in Caliburn. There's even talk that he might become the 5th Master Knight within 10 years. Listening to Evan's words, Elan nodded in admiration. And then, 6 months later. Count, what? Deus has become one of the 5 Master Knights in Caliburn. Already? Yes. Elan was left in a daze by Evan's words. This all happened within just 1 year of the 5 sins leaving the orphanage. A year is indeed a long time. It was enough time for Elan to officially undergo the succession ceremony and become the Count of Palacio, and it also allowed him to steadily become accustomed to the duties that a count must manage. However, 1 year is by no means enough time for an ordinary person with no prior knowledge of swordsmanship to become a Master Knight. Evan, yes, Master Knight, that means Swordmaster, right? Yes, that's correct. Swordmaster. To Elan, who had read countless fantasy novels, the title seemed rather unimpressive. However, unlike other mass-produced fantasy settings where simply wielding an aura blade was enough to be considered a swordmaster, Elan knew that the swordmasters of this world operated on a completely different scale. Information about the swordmasters of Psychedelia flashed through Alan's mind. In this world, a swordmaster wasn't just someone who could wield an aura blade. A swordmaster was a being who, beyond that, could unlock a unique ability called a derivative and could leap over castle walls with a single bound. In other words, a swordmaster in this world was more accurately described as a superhuman, rather than just a swordsman who wielded an aura-clad blade. So, are you telling me that Deus has become one of those swordmasters? Privacy settings. Well, technically, he's just on the verge of becoming one. While it's true that he's been recognized as a Master Knight, according to information from the guild, he hasn't yet created a derivative. Then he's not really a Master Knight, is he? That might be due to the Northern Barbarians. Ah, at Evan's words, Elan immediately understood why Deus was recognized as a Master Knight. Yes, Caliburn had been waging war against the Northern Barbarians for over 10 years, and last year, they had lost one of their 5 Master Knights in the Northern conflict. Remembering this, Elan nodded. They're trying to quell anxiety while also proclaiming that they're still strong. There are probably a few other reasons as well, but that seems to be the main one. So, Deus isn't quite at the level of a Master Knight yet. No, it's just that he hasn't unlocked his derivative yet. But according to the Information Guild, he's already considered to be at the level of a Master Knight. They say that even Fiola, the fourth sword and a Master Knight herself, was defeated by Deus in a duel. Hearing Evan's words, Alon let out a small laugh and muttered to himself, "How old is the youngest Master Knight?" "As far as I know, the youngest was 32 years old. Reinhardt, the first sword of Caliburn, held the record, or at least, he used to." "Was he the youngest?" "Yes, isn't he quite famous?" Alon nodded at Evan's words. Well, he wasn't particularly interested in fame. He knew that Reinhardt was an extraordinarily powerful individual. He remembered how Reinhardt always appeared during the third main episode of the game, to temporarily assist the protagonist as an ally. Didn't he start wielding a sword at the age of 5 with incredible talent? Recalling the typical narration that would accompany Reinhardt's entrance as a companion, Alon let out a laugh. It had taken Reinhardt over 20 years to reach the level of a Master Knight. Despite his unbelievable talent and strength, becoming a Master Knight in just 1 year. Does that even make sense? It's absolutely unbelievable. Even those with talent take 5 years just to awaken mana, 10 years to envelop their swords in it, and decades to create a derivative. Yet Deus cleared the first 2 stages in just 1 year. As Evan spoke, clicking his tongue with a hint of envy, Alon found himself unconsciously rubbing his chin. "I knew he had talent, but I never imagined it would be to this extent." Well, it's a good thing. Privacy settings. From Alan's perspective, Deus's success wasn't something to mourn but to celebrate. The more successful Deus became, the more opportunities Alon would have to benefit from it in the future. Opportunities, I should be able to seize them, right? Alon glanced at the letters sitting on a desk in the corner of his office. The letters were from Utia, who was in the Holy Kingdom of Rosario. Or maybe I won't. The reason Alon had such a conflicted expression was that over the past year, he had only received letters from Utia. It seemed that the 5 of them were still communicating with each other. Well, I guess it can't be helped since I've never met them in person. But still, I prepared personal gifts for each of them. So not getting even a word of thanks feels a bit too much, doesn't it? Though Alan's expression remained neutral, there was a hint of frustration as he shook his head slightly. In truth, considering his original goal, Alon should have been grateful that the 5 sins hadn't destroyed any kingdoms. And so, with a slightly bitter expression, Alon thought to himself, as long as they're living well, that's enough for me. In the central district of Caliburn's capital, Kurtum, there is a grand mansion located in the southern area, where only the highest-ranking nobles of the country reside. It was here that Deus Micalian, the leader of the famous Knight Order Eclipse and the youngest person in the country to be granted the title of Master Knight, lived. You, in a stately office that wasn't quite to his taste, but one he used nonetheless. Deus let out a quiet sigh, gazing leisurely out the window toward the mansion's garden. Brother, he spotted a young girl with the same deep purple eyes as him, waving at him with a bright smile from the garden. Seeing her, Deus couldn't help but smile back. The girl waved for a while before resuming her walk around the garden, and as Deus watched her, he found himself reminiscing about the past year, about the moment he had met the family he thought was dead and received the gift from the Great Moon. A year ago, Deus Micalian had already joined the Blue Moon and was operating under its guidance. However, unlike Utia, he wasn't blindly devoted to the Great Moon. Although he was aware that the Great Moon had saved his life, that alone wasn't enough to make him pledge his loyalty. Thus, the reason Deus Micalian was affiliated with the Great Moon back then was twofold. First, to receive training from Utia, and second, because the Great Moon had promised him the chance for revenge against the Black Sheep. After all, since losing his family whom he valued as much as his own life, Deus had been consumed by anger and festering hatred, unable to sleep at night. Therefore, when he first received his mission, Deus wasn't particularly pleased with it. While he understood that his previous tasks under the Blue Moon were meant to deal with dark entities, this new mission seemed entirely out of the blue. Privacy settings. But when he arrived in Caliburn and reached the small inn in the southern region, where the letter from the Great Moon mentioned a gift, Deus couldn't believe his eyes. His sister, who should have been killed by the Black Sheep, was there, alive and well, working at the inn. Deus cleared his throat awkwardly, even though no one else was around. Thinking back, he still felt embarrassed about how, upon seeing his sister at the inn, he had immediately embraced her and burst into tears. After that emotional reunion, Deus learned about everything that had happened to his sister, Silly. She recounted how she had been dragged into a dark place by the Black Sheep, waiting for her turn to be killed when a bright light suddenly pulled her back outside. She had nearly been sold to a slaver, but was saved by a man named Evan. Then, Count Palacio had provided her with precious medicine and continued to support and protect her until Deus arrived. After hearing all of this, Deus couldn't help but wonder how the Great Moon had known all of these things. He had never mentioned his family to anyone in the Blue Moon, nor did Yutia know anything about what had happened to him, except that he had been attacked by the Black Sheep. But before long, Deus stopped pondering this mystery. Instead, he recalled Yutia's words, the words she would often say to him. He knows everything. Soon, you'll understand why I follow him. At first, he had dismissed those words, but now they were starting to make sense. Remembering them, Deus offered his gratitude to the Great Moon. For someone like him, who had been consumed by vengeance, the survival of his sister, and the fact that his own name had been secretly protecting her, was the greatest gift and an incomparable blessing. No matter what happens, Deus vowed to repay this kindness. Following the Great Moon's orders, he became a knight in Caliburn. Ironically, becoming a knight was easy for him. Aside from his existing abilities, Deus discovered that he had a surprising and exceptional talent for the sword. He knows everything. It was then that Deus realized that Yuji's words weren't just blind fanaticism but the truth. And by the time he became a knight, Deus understood why the Great Moon had sent him here to become a knight. My mission is to create a royal guard. Whether it was because of the battles with the barbarians or not, Caliburn allowed anyone who gained the king's recognition to form a knight order. Moreover, if someone became a master knight, they were permitted to exceed the usual limit on the number of members in their knight order. But this knight order wouldn't be made up of street thugs. Instead, it would be composed of talented swordsmen who had come to Caliburn to become knights. Commander, it's time. All right. Privacy settings. Deus stood up, acknowledging the knight who had spoken to him with eyes full of respect. He headed toward the training grounds. The knights, dressed in the black iron armor that symbolized eclipse, were preparing to depart on an expedition to fight the barbarians. Standing on the inspection platform, Deus looked over the assembled knights. He knew that not all of them would return with smiles on their faces. However, for Deus, this wasn't a significant issue. The Knight Order, the royal guard that would serve the Great Moon, needed to be stronger, far stronger than they were now. Deus knew all too well that the Great Moon didn't desire a Knight Order. That would fall to mere northern barbarians. And so, unlike other knight commanders who would encourage and inspire their troops, Deus drew his sword and quietly uttered the motto of Eclipse, "Prove yourself under the moon." With those words, he embarked on the expedition to fight the barbarians, aiming to create the greatest knight order worthy of serving the Great Moon. There were only 4 years left until the start of the original story. At the same time, it had been just over a year and 1 month since all the members of the Five Sins who had been in the orphanage became independent. What is Seolrang up to? Elan, who was looking at the letter from Yutia that had arrived today as usual, suddenly grew curious about Seolrang. Although Yutia's letters always included stories about her and the other members of the Five Sins, there hadn't been a single mention of Seolrang since about 2 months after her independence. No way, she didn't die in some distant place, did she? After pondering for a moment, Elan shook his head resolutely. According to Yutia's previous letters, Seolrang had already arrived in the Desert Nation. If she had followed the letter's instructions correctly, there was no way she would die in such a manner. The gift Elan had given her would turn her into a formidable Baba Yaga. That, too, as a gladiator in the colony, where the strong could gain everything. It was even written in the item description. It must be correct, right? Who liked to read through every detail of item descriptions, thanks to the developer's habit of filling them with various bits of lore? Recalled the phrase written in the item Seolrang would acquire. If the sin of greed had obtained it, they would have fallen and become a sin. But instead, she would become a great warrior. I think that was it. Privacy settings. Of course, the effect Elan received when he used that item was merely a 20% increase in critical hit rate, but the grand background story that came with it was why he had told Seolrang its location. Furthermore, in case the item description turned out to be something truly insignificant, he also included the location of a hidden treasure. But it had been 9 months since he last heard from her. Maybe I should have just given her the treasure quietly. As Elan considered this, he shook his head briefly. The reason he had sent Seolrang to the colony in the first place was because of the narration, claiming she had the talent of a warrior. Moreover, since Elan couldn't support her for her entire life, becoming independent was a crucial process. No, it's better if she can make a living on her own. Therefore, considering Deus's absurd talent, Seolring surely hadn't died. But what on earth happened? Well, Alan wore a strange expression, pondering Seolring's whereabouts. In a desert cave deep within the southern region of the Desert Nation colony, a girl emerged. The girl, Seolring, looked disheveled. Dirt clung to various parts of her body, and her hair had grown so long it almost covered her face. However, unlike her appearance, Seolring's face bore a wide smile. It's finally over. Stretching with a sense of liberation, she looked at the gloves on her hands. The golden claws adorned on them were a gift bestowed upon her by the Great Moon, the essence of the Golden Mane tribe. How could the Great Moon know where this was? After finishing the trial and emerging, she tilted her head in curiosity while gazing at the gloves. And rightly so, this essence of the Golden Mane tribe was a legendary artifact that had been passed down through her people, the Golden Mane tribe, for generations. It was truly deserving of the title legendary. Hundreds of years ago, this item had empowered the Golden Mane tribe, allowing them to ascend as the rulers of all beastmen and granting them the power to become kings. Of course, most of what she knew came from tales her mother had told her when she was very young. Having matured somewhat since then, Seolring had assumed those old stories were exaggerated to some extent. But now, in this moment, having worn the essence and been pulled into the inner world to undergo all the trials, Seolring realized that not a single part of those fantastical old tales was a lie. Privacy settings. As she lightly drew out her power, her golden eyes began to glow softly within the dark cave. And that wasn't all. Her hair, and even her tail, began to shimmer as if they were radiating light, just like the Golden Mane tribe of ancient legends that her mother used to tell her about. Smiling at her newfound power, her thoughts drifted once again to the Great Moon. There were countless questions swirling in her mind, but she soon dismissed them. She knew she wasn't particularly intelligent, and she was well aware that it was beyond her to deduce how the Great Moon knew all these things. Most importantly, she realized one simple, clear truth. The Great Moon was her savior, the one who had rescued her from dying as a result of bio-experiments, and at the same time, the one to whom she owed a debt for granting her the power to exact revenge on the Black Dragon, who had killed her parents. As blue electricity crackled around her, she thought of the Great Moon's command, but soon shook her head. Even if she wasn't particularly smart, she knew that becoming a mere gladiator wasn't the true purpose of her benefactor's will. Thus, Seolring's gaze naturally shifted to the gloves that held the power to empower the Golden Mane tribe. It was only then that Seolring finally grasped the Great Moon's intention to become a famous gladiator, gather the scattered members of the Golden Mane tribe from across the land, and, she grinned, kill the Black Dragon with them. Seeing the perfect answer before her, Seolring smiled. Zap! Blue sparks flew everywhere in response to her emotions, but she paid them no mind. With a deep smile, she began walking out of the dark cave. The moon hung in the sky where she emerged from the cave, bathing the entire desert in a blue glow. And then, for the sake of that one, muttering the phrase that had become a habitual chant by now, let's begin. The Golden Mane tribe, who had been known as the greatest beastmen and the kings of all beastmen 500 years ago, began their revival under the blue moon. Privacy settings. Starting from about a year ago, after returning from the ball, Elan had found a new interest in exploring phrases, and had been investing a significant amount of time in it. Unlike in the game, where chanting phrases consumed a turn and each turn increased magical attack power by 10% to 20%, the phrases in this world indeed altered the properties of magic, just as he had predicted. Take, for example, the phrases Elan used several months ago in a place he visited to obtain restrictions. Phrases like refraction, repulsion, blue light, and diffraction line. Refraction strengthened the instability of a completed spell, causing its range to expand. Repulsion distorted the form of the spell, allowing the transferred projectile to shift. In the case of blue light, it amplified spells conducted in parallel, like lightning magic. Lastly, the diffraction line granted a spell penetration or critical properties. Of course, Alan's understanding was based only on the data he had accumulated over the past 6 months, so the accuracy of these interpretations was still uncertain, but it was clear that each phrase endowed a different property. Additionally, he had figured out several unique rules regarding phrases. Using the same phrase repeatedly is prohibited. Using phrases incompatible with the spell is forbidden, and no more than 5 phrases can be used in a single spell. If any of these 3 rules are broken, the spell either fails to manifest or becomes weakened. There seemed to be a few other rules as well, but he hadn't figured those out yet. Although Alan had plenty of time to explore magic, he could only use magic once per day. If only there were a book about phrases. The phrases Alan used were, according to the lore, the forgotten phrases of Babel, considered to be akin to lost relics in this world. The places where Alan had found phrases were limited to those that had phrases inscribed, but they did not explain the rules or phenomena behind them. In other words, he had to discover everything through direct experimentation. But Alan didn't find this bothersome. Alan's talent was enough to make his exploration of phrases enjoyable, and to immerse him in the study of magic. Thus, after finishing his conversation with Evan, he came straight to the training hall and, as usual, began casting a spell. Whew! His hand formed the familiar sign of wisdom, the Jikwon Mudra. Simultaneously, the magic gathered to form the spell he had been experimenting with for about 2 months. A second-tier spell called Chain Lightning. Privacy settings. Following Alan's thoughts, the arranged mana formed a spherical orb, deliberately leaving out a specific point to create imbalance. Zap! The spell completed. With Alan's limited mana, the magic emitted a faint glow. The only improvement from 2 months ago was that the imbalance caused by the lightning spell had become slightly more refined, likely due to his growing familiarity with it. To put it nicely, the spell had become more precise. To put it bluntly, it was still just a useless spell that was only good for its precision. However, by chanting the phrases, even a useless spell could be given a purpose. Fixation. The lightning that had been crackling before him froze in place, as if time itself had stopped. Compression. At his next muttering, the once large sphere shrank into a small bead while remaining frozen in place. Collapse. Crack. With the final phrase, the once small bead lost its form as a sphere. What remained was pure lightning, a fragment of mana appearing before Alan like countless irregular dotted lines gathered together. And then, momentary bloom. As Alan muttered the final phrase, releasing the Jikwon Mudra he had been holding, sap, a massive tree of thunder materialized before him, radiating a brilliance more dazzling than the midday sun. The blue tree stood still, flaunting its presence. It was as if lightning had struck and was frozen in place. Alan nodded in satisfaction. The order of the phrases also changes the spell's manifestation. He recalled how, when he had used collapse before fixation in his previous spell, the magic had disappeared without a trace, and he nodded contentedly. Even phrases that don't match the spell can be used if there's a prior phrase that leads into them. Satisfied with the new information he had gained, Alan confirmed that the tree of thunder he had created was gradually fading away, though it seemed unlikely that he would ever have a use for it. Privacy settings. Muttering this, Alan felt a pang of regret as he turned around. His mana hole now completely drained. His body only allowed him to cast magic once a day, and just as he turned around, Alan saw her. There, in the training hall of Count Palacio's estate, stood a young lady he never wanted to get close to, Lady Kalia, the daughter of the Count of Zenonia. Seemingly shocked by the situation, the usually noble and refined Kalia stood with her mouth agape, an expression of genuine surprise. My goodness. Hearing her shocked voice, Alan turned his gaze away, missing his chance to ask why she was there. Origin. Standing next to her, a middle-aged man, his mouth also wide open in shock, was holding an ornate cane as he stared at Alan with a similarly astonished expression. And then, Alan, confused by the two's reactions, came to a sudden realization. He had heard the man mention Origin, a spell that could only be cast by mages who had reached the 7th rank, and then understood one thing. He had somehow become the subject of a massive misunderstanding. Lady Zenonia, or rather Zenonia Kalia, who had effectively been ruling the Zenonia County by making her father a puppet for several years, had come to Count Palacio's estate for 2 main reasons. One reason was to gauge the intentions of Alan. Now Count Palacio, despite holding cards that could cause substantial damage to the current Zenonia County, he hadn't used them. The relationship between Zenonia County and Palacio County wasn't necessarily bad, but she knew that the essence of the Count was similar to her own, a kindred spirit, so to speak. In other words, she easily understood that Alan wasn't the type to wield such powerful cards out of some trivial sentimentality or misplaced compassion. She had come to ascertain his true intentions. The second reason was to assess the power of the organization that Count Palacio was rumored to control. Of course, Kalia knew that just meeting the Count wouldn't reveal the full extent of the shadowy organization. He commanded. However, Kalia had a way to glimpse at the fringes of that power. There was the wizard Bianco. He had once proposed a new theory on forgotten-era magic within the Magic Tower, earning academic acclaim, but he was later expelled from the tower due to his excessively inhumane magical experiments. However, despite his expulsion, his rank was still 5th tier. Privacy settings. He was strong enough to obliterate an entire battalion of soldiers by himself. Kalia had brought him along in exchange for assisting with his experiments. Forging an alliance with him, she reasoned that if a wizard like Bianco, who specialized in detection magic and was on the cusp of the 5th tier, was present, he could easily assess the caliber of those protecting Count Palacio. While the nature of one's guards didn't reveal everything, observing the level of those guarding the Count could naturally offer insights into the organization's inner workings. At least, that was why she had brought Bianco along. In the reception room of Count Palacio's estate, Lady Kalia subtly glanced at Bianco, who still hadn't fully closed his mouth and wore an anxious expression. She was inwardly surprised. As far as she knew, he wasn't someone who would normally show such foolish expressions in front of others. Bianco's face was always arrogant, and he never spoke politely to anyone, not even to her, who supported him. Of course, Kalia understood why Bianco was like this. Even though he was a wizard expelled from the Magic Tower, the fact that he had reached the pinnacle of the 5th tier lent credibility and justification to his attitude. But now, Bianco's expression was extremely unusual. His face was still marked by shock, just as it had been earlier, and she could even detect flickers of fear, something she had never seen in him before. Why? Kalia felt a mix of curiosity and unease as she looked at Bianco. She had never seen him display such blatant fear. If he's reacting like this, could it really be that the magic we saw earlier was an origin spell? Kalia's thought was fleeting, as she quickly refocused on the present situation and met Alan's gaze. His eyes were the same as before. His gaze, which seemed to find no value in the current situation, moved slowly and indifferently over Bianco and Kalia. Silence. My apologies, Count Palacio. I've been rude. Kalia was the first to break the silence. Although she was still Lady Zenonia on the surface, she respectfully addressed the Count and apologized for entering the training grounds. Even though she tried to excuse her actions, peering into someone else's training ground was clearly an affront, even if not a serious one. After a moment of silence, Alan spoke. No need to blame yourself. Privacy settings. Thank you. Under normal circumstances, I would ask why you visited the county, but before that, let me clarify one thing. Please, go ahead. In response to Kalia's answer, Alan spoke without hesitation. What I used wasn't origin. It seems the wizard you brought along misunderstood. Is that so? Indeed, my magic skills aren't particularly exceptional. If I had to rank them, they would be around the 2nd tier. Naturally, Kalia didn't believe Alan's words. Even though she wasn't well versed in magic, she could easily tell that the magic Alan had displayed was anything but ordinary. She turned her gaze subtly back to Bianco and was even more surprised. His expression was worse than before. However, despite his sour expression, he seemed to have understood the underlying message in Alan's words. It seems I was mistaken. Bianco forced out the words. Kalia was once again startled. Hearing him speak in polite language for the first time in 5 years, he usually spoke informally. Yes, you seem quite capable, so you've likely already noticed. But that magic is of no practical use. Now then, since the misunderstanding has been cleared up, what brings you to the county? Without hesitation, Alan moved the conversation forward, prompting Kalia to quickly collect herself and respond. It wasn't anything special. I happened to be in the area for some business and thought of you, so I decided to stop by briefly. Is that so? Yes. After pondering for a moment, Alan spoke. Unfortunately, I'm quite busy and won't be able to chat for long. That's fine. I only stopped by briefly. I just wanted to pay my respects. If you're in need of conversation, it might be a good idea to visit the Duke of Alsha. The Duke of Alsha, you say? Yes, I think the two of you would get along quite well. If you say so, I'll consider visiting the Duke. Privacy settings. Lady Zenonia smiled as she replied to Alan, who spoke with an indifferent expression. However, her mouth was dry. Why would Lady Zenonia, from that notorious family in the West, visit you? Watching as Lady Zenonia's carriage gradually disappeared into the distance, Evan asked the question, and Alan answered. How would I know? Is that so? Evan looked puzzled, but Alan genuinely had nothing more to say this time. He couldn't guess why Kalia had come either. It's annoying that I showed her my magic. Elan thought about the wizard from Zenonia who had mistaken his magic for origin. Let's just hope rumors about me using origin don't start spreading. In this world, rumors carried more power than one might think. If a rumor spread that Elan could use origin, a spell only supreme wizards in this world could cast, it might seem advantageous at first glance, but it would actually be a major headache. In this dark fantasy world, it wasn't hard to find madmen who couldn't resist picking fights with anyone strong. If he had a solid backer, that might be another story, but without one, if strange rumors spread, it would be more than just an annoyance. Dangerously powerful individuals could start picking fights with him for no reason. In fact, Elan could already think of 8 strong people who would come looking for him if they heard he could use origin, so he wanted to nip any rumors in the bud quickly. Hopefully, she understood, as he recalled the wizard nodding in agreement before sending Lady Zenonia off. To clear up any misunderstandings, Elan continued his thoughts with an uncomfortable expression. Why on earth are they interested in me anyway? For Elan, Kalia was not just an interesting, she was someone he wanted to avoid as much as possible. If they somehow became close, the likelihood of getting involved in the underworld would increase naturally. He did introduce her to the Duke of Alsha, though he knew there was no way Lady Zenonia would actually seek out the Duke. Even so, the reason he introduced her to the Duke of Alsha was more about sending a message that he had no interest in associating with her. Don't come looking for me. Privacy settings. With that thought, Elan ended his musings about Kalia. Meanwhile, inside the carriage, was the magic Count Palacio used really origin? Kalia was asking. Unlike his usual immediate responses, Bianca remained silent, just as Kalia was about to speak again. It wasn't origin. Bianca finally spoke. It wasn't origin. Then what was that earlier display? As Kalia questioned him, clearly not understanding, Bianca took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, and began to explain. Origin is the endpoint of all wizards, a canvas of sorts. It is a canvas allowed only to those who have established magic as a truth, where they can draw their own unique laws. Magic that possesses its own unique arrangements and manifestation formulas, painted onto an unchanging canvas. This is what we call origin. However, he swallowed and continued. Count Palacio's magic was different. In what way? It wasn't drawing on a canvas. To be more precise, his magic was akin to tearing the canvas apart. When Kalia looked at him, clearly not comprehending, Bianca explained further. In other words, he was twisting the truth that should remain unchangeable. Although I only saw it for a fleeting moment, since I was using the observation eye at your request, I saw it clearly. Bianca muttered, fixing lightning that shouldn't stop, twisting the laws to collapse the spell that had been manifested, and yet still managing to manifest it flawlessly. It was an unbelievable miracle. And behind it, he stopped speaking abruptly. The image of Count Palacio from earlier flashed in his mind. At the moment when he displayed that incredible magic, his eyes had revealed a talent that could only be attained upon reaching the 6th tier, even if acquired later in life. A talent that Bianca had only barely glimpsed after reaching the peak of the 5th tier. Due to his own latent talent, eyes that could perceive the world itself. It was an eye. Privacy settings. A pair of jet black eyes, with 2 crimson rings encircling the pupils. Those eyes had appeared when the Count used his magic. As soon as the magic disappeared, so too did those eyes, vanishing as if they had never existed. Recalling this, Bianca could not hide the fear that filled his own eyes. If it was what he thought it was, the Count had accessed the power of a forgotten ancient god when he used that magic. But Bianca cut off his own thoughts, even using magic to force himself to stop thinking. Having delved into ancient knowledge, he was well aware of how dangerous it was to try to infer the truth behind such things through further thought. Thus, let me give you one piece of advice. Never make an enemy of him. Do not oppose Count Palacio. What? That's all the advice I can give. Having said that much, Bianca fell silent. Lady Zenonia also kept her silence. At the same time, Kalia naturally recalled Alan's expressionless face and his calm gaze as he had looked at her. Sigh. Without realizing it, she let out a self-deprecating smile, because through Bianca's words, she had realized something. There was no point in trying to understand Count Palacio's intentions from the start. At the same time, if you're in need of conversation, it might be a good idea to visit the Duke of Alsha. The Duke of Alsha. Yes, I think the two of you would get along quite well. She had also realized that she had already become nothing more than a pawn on his chessboard. The carriage remained steeped in silence for a long while. And then, about 5 months later, by now quite accustomed to his role and proficiently handling the duties of the Count, Alon realized something. "Ah, Count, did you hear about this? Privacy settings." "Hear about what?" "I heard that the Zenonia County and the Duke of Alsha have formed an alliance." "What?" Alon realized that the Kingdom of Asteria was now facing a crisis. In the Kingdom of Asteria, there are 3 major clandestine families. One is the Ducal House of Alsha in the north, another is the Count's House of Zenonia in the west, and lastly, the Count's House of Palatio in the east. These 3 families, originally, divided the underworld of the Kingdom of Asteria into 3 parts, forming a massive shadow organization. By the time the original story begins, these families have grown powerful enough to subtly manipulate the kingdom from the shadows. The House of Palatio, however, had long since fallen from power after the assassination of Leo, which led to the complete disintegration of their organization. Thus, only the Ducal House of Alsha and the Count's House of Zenonia remain as shadowy forces within the kingdom. At first glance, the alliance between the 2 doesn't seem to be a major issue. Is that true? Have you ever seen me lie, Count? That's true. Of course, since the agreement was made in the underworld, there might not be any obvious signs on the surface, but it appears that the alliance is genuine. The reason Alon was so alarmed was that he roughly understood the situation of the shadow forces. At the beginning of the original story, when the protagonist arrives in the Kingdom of Asteria, the 3 families possess immense power but are unable to wield it properly, due to their constant checks on each other. However, with the House of Palatio now out of the picture, if the House of Zenonia and the House of Alsha were to join forces, there would be no one left in the kingdom capable of stopping them. Privacy settings. In other words, if things continue as they are, the 2 shadow forces could end up ruling the kingdom as if it were their own playground. As Alon pondered how the situation had reached this point, he suddenly recalled something he had said to Lady Zenonia a few months prior. Could it be? He wondered if the alliance, which should never have blossomed within the Kingdom of Asteria, had somehow come about because of something he said, but he quickly shook his head, dismissing the thought. Even if he didn't fully understand the character of Roria, the Duke of Alsha, he knew Lady Kalia of the House of Zenonia all too well. She was the epitome of a villainess, the type who could not stand being on the same level as others or beneath anyone. She would stop at nothing, including committing the most brutal acts, to climb higher. With that thought, Alon felt a bit more at ease, knowing Kalia's personality. The alliance was bound to be temporary. Evan, yes, bring me some stationery later. Stationery, yes. Still, knowing that nothing in life is 100% certain, Alon decided to take some precautionary measures. Speaking of which, Count, I looked into the rumors about Sioran you asked about earlier. It seems the rumors have been spreading recently. Really? At Evan's words, Alon turned his head. What kind of rumors? I heard that he's been very active recently in the colony. He's even earned the nickname Golden Flash. The Golden Flash. With a brief sense of familiarity with the name, Alon sighed in relief. Although he had always believed that Sioran would never die in obscurity, he had been worried, which is why he had included a note in his last letter to Yuja asking about Sioran. I'm glad he's doing well. Indeed, in that place, if you gain enough fame as a fighter, you can be treated even better than a noble. If you're strong enough, you can even stand on equal footing with the king. With those brief thoughts, Alon accepted the stationery Evan handed him and spoke. Oh, and I'm planning to visit the tower in about a week. Privacy settings. The tower. Yes, it might take some time. It'll only be 2 weeks, right? At Evan's puzzled question, Alon shook his head. It'll probably take about a month. A month, as far as I know. The Green Tower is only about a week's journey from the Count's estate. I'm not going to the Green Tower. I'm going to the Blue Tower. If it's the Blue Tower, then it will take a while. But is there a particular reason to go there? The Blue Tower is located between Caliburn and the Labyrinth City, isn't it? As Evan said, the Blue Tower was much farther away, taking more than 3 weeks to reach. I have some business at the Blue Tower. Alon gave a brief answer and continued writing his letter, signaling that the conversation was over. Realizing this, Evan clicked his tongue in resignation and said, Then I'll start preparing in advance. Please do. With a light bow, Evan left the room. For a while, Alon wrote a letter to Lady Zenonia in silence. Once he finished sealing the letter, he let out a light sigh. It's going to be tough living in a carriage for 3 weeks just to reach the Blue Tower. Although Alon inwardly grumbled about how exhausting it would be, he was determined to go to the Blue Tower because there was something there he needed to obtain. I have no choice but to do this for the sake of my magic. At the Blue Tower, there was an item that could assist with his half-baked talent, which only allowed him to properly study magic once a day. As Alon thought about this, he suddenly remembered the Labyrinth City next to the Blue Tower. Labyrinth City, Lartania. In the heart of this city, fitting its name, there lies an endless labyrinth extending underground. It was one of the few places in Psychedelia where players could grind for experience and items without progressing the story. As the name suggests, the deeper one went into the labyrinth, the more experience and treasures they could obtain. However, no one who played Psychedelia ever reached the end of the labyrinth. Although it allowed players to level up without advancing the story, the game required players to return to the surface every 5 floors, which caused a day to pass in-game. Even though the story didn't progress, time still moved forward. If a player focused on exploring the labyrinth and neglected the story, they might one day emerge to find the world in chaos. Privacy settings. To avoid this outcome, players had to advance the story while exploring the labyrinth. Naturally, as players balanced both, they usually reached the 70th floor of the labyrinth before the game ended. Thus, no one ever reached the end of the labyrinth in Psychedelia. There was a rumor that someone using cheats had made it to the 150th floor, but there were more floors beyond that. As Alon recalled a vaguely remembered post from a community whose name he could barely remember, he switched his thoughts to Rhine. I hope she's doing well. Alon had sent Rhine to Lartania, not to make her a labyrinth explorer, but to train her as a magic appraiser. In Lartania, countless relics and artifacts were discovered daily in the labyrinth, making appraisers highly sought after. Magic appraisers, who could identify even the most detailed abilities of an item, were highly respected professionals. Moreover, by obtaining a certification as a magic appraiser in Lartania, one could live a prosperous life without worrying about money. That's why Alon had sent her there. Like the other 5 deadly sins, Rhine possessed a unique talent, the Library of Eternity, which was well suited for this role. Well, with the gift I gave her, she should find appraising a bit easier. Alon mused with a slightly awkward expression. Come to think of it, the gift I gave Rhine seems a bit small compared to what I gave the others. Unlike the gifts he had given to the other 5 deadly sins, Alon had only given Rhine an item specialized for equipment appraisals, which made him feel a bit embarrassed now. If it turns out to be insufficient, I'll have to provide some additional support later. Accepting that there was nothing he could do about what had already passed, Alon shrugged his shoulders. It was a leisurely day. Labyrinth City, Lartania, in the southern district of this independent city, which had an overwhelmingly large number of explorers and mercenaries compared to other nations, there was an appraisal shop called Merd. The shop, run by a magic appraiser who concealed their identity, wasn't located in the best area. Even in a labyrinth city where appraisers were highly valued, the central area near the labyrinth was home to numerous appraisal shops. In other words, there wasn't much reason for people to visit Merd in the southern district. Yet, despite this, a steady stream of customers visited the shop every day. Moreover, the types of customers were unique. Most were A-rank explorers who ventured deep into the labyrinth, and among Merd's customers were nobles from other countries and even the Lord of Lartania. The appraisals are complete, my lord. Oh, how is this relic? It's a device that continuously generates flames when infused with magic. The Lord of Lartania smiled broadly as he received the relic from the masked woman and glanced down, noticing the black eye emblem engraved at the bottom of the relic. Privacy settings. Oh, could it be that this relic has the ability to be engraved? Yes. How does the engraving affect its power? The efficiency has improved dramatically. Now, even with just a small amount of magic, the flames will last for an hour. That's truly impressive. I'm always indebted to you. Think nothing of it. With that, the masked woman gave a light response to the masked man's words. The Lord, with a delighted expression, vanished from sight as he left the room. Once the Lord had exited, leaving the office in silence, the woman, who was actually Rhine, removed her crescent moon-adorned mask with a sigh. She gazed out the window at the engraving the Lord now held in his hands. That very engraving was the reason why the shop Merd, despite being located in the southern district, was earning more money than any other appraiser's shop. Rhine could do more than just appraise relics brought by high-ranking individuals. She could also engrave certain relics to further enhance their abilities. However, this was not Rhine's own ability. Her talent lay in using the library to accurately identify the nature of relics and determine which specific relics could be engraved. The ability to engrave was thanks to the gift from the Great Moon. As Rhine turned her gaze slightly and opened the door to the adjacent office, she entered a small room where a golden eye, surrounded by a blue halo, was operating. 248 above 500. Looking at the display floating above the halo, Rhine recalled the first time she had discovered this gift from the Great Moon. At first, Rhine, like the others, didn't understand why the Great Moon had sent her to the Labyrinth City and made her an appraiser, although she suspected it was related to dealing with the Black Ones. Given her knowledge of their forgotten existence, she still couldn't fully grasp the connection. At the very least, she knew from her library how powerful the Black Ones were, but she couldn't see how becoming an appraiser was related to fighting them. But after discovering the gift from the Great Moon, she had no choice but to change her thinking. The gift was the Eye of the Wanderer, an artifact capable of appraising relics that contained a certain level of magic. However, Rhine, with her library, instantly recognized that this eye was far from ordinary. Even though it initially appeared as nothing more than a simple sphere, Rhine unlocked the seals layered upon its seals that even her library didn't recognize, and it revealed its true form, unlocking one specific ability. That ability was engraving. Engraving allowed her to inscribe certain relics from the upper echelons, thereby enhancing their abilities. Privacy settings. But ironically, the first thing the Eye of the Wanderer unlocked wasn't an ability per se. Rather than an ability, it was a means to offer sacrifices. With each engraving, the relic's power would increase. But Rhine knew that the golden eye absorbed something unknown in exchange for the engraving, something even she couldn't comprehend. She could sense that the eye was fundamentally changing each time this happened. My task is to awaken this eye. When Rhine realized this, she came to two conclusions. First, only she could awaken this eye. The eye only responded to relics with specific patterns from the upper echelons, and if she brought it a relic that didn't meet these criteria, the accumulated power would diminish. Second, the eye would eventually grant her enough power to stand against the Black Ones. Thus, Rhine followed the will of the Great Moon, watching as the eye gradually awakened with each relic it absorbed. Everything is to kill the Black Wolf. Muttering this to herself, Rhine gently caressed the golden eye floating in the air, and, to follow his will, a faint, inexplicable fanaticism gleamed in Rhine's eyes. About 3 weeks later, as Alan had told Evan, he arrived at the Blue Tower by carriage. Originally, he had planned to meet the Tower Master as scheduled, but unfortunately, the Tower Master was absent, so he had to meet with the Vice Master instead. But then, come on, hurry up and state your business, I'm busy. Faced with this curt and dismissive attitude, Alan wore a bewildered expression.